Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was the summer of 2008 when everything started. I was 24 years old, fresh out of college, and desperately in need of a break from city life. My cousin Eric, who was just a year older, had been working as a maintenance technician for a series of lighthouses along the Maine coast. He'd been pestering me for months to visit, claiming the isolation and beauty of the coastline would do me good. That summer, I finally gave in. The drive up was uneventful, though long, as I followed winding roads that snaked their way toward the small coastal town where Eric's lighthouse was located. It was a remote place, far removed from the conveniences I was used to. The air smelled different out there, saltier, heavier, and somehow cleaner. The town itself was tiny, with just one general store, a gas station, and a diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. I was used to the hum of traffic and city lights. Here, the silence was so complete it was almost oppressive. Eric met me at the diner, grinning from ear to ear. His sunburnt face and wind-tangled hair made him look like he belonged in a painting of rugged sailors. He greeted me with a hearty clap on the back and ordered us both coffee, though it was nearly dinner time. He always joked that coffee was his blood, and judging by the energy he had, I believed him. After catching up over a greasy plate of fish and chips, we packed into his beat-up old truck and headed toward the lighthouse. "You're gonna love this place," he said, gesturing to the coastline as we drove. "It's quiet, sure, but it grows on you. And the view? Man, you won't believe the sunsets." When we pulled up to the lighthouse, I had to admit he was right about the view. The structure itself was tall and weathered, its white paint peeling in places, but it stood proud against the backdrop of crashing waves and the fiery glow of the setting sun. Behind it, Eric's small cottage was tucked into the rocks, cozy and unimposing. I could hear the rhythmic roar of the ocean, and the scent of salt water filled the air. We spent that first evening settling in. Eric showed me around the lighthouse, explaining his duties and the quirks of the old structure. The spiral staircase that led to the lantern room creaked underfoot, and the heavy door at the top needed a good shove to open. Inside, the massive glass lens reflected the light in a kaleidoscope of colors, and Eric explained how he maintained the mechanisms to ensure everything stayed in working order. That night, we sat outside the cottage, sipping coffee as the stars came out. It was the clearest night sky I'd ever seen, with constellations I could barely identify stretching from horizon to horizon. The waves crashing against the rocks below seemed almost hypnotic. "Ever get bored out here?" I asked him. Eric laughed. "Nah, it's peaceful. Besides, there's always something to fix or maintain. Keeps me busy." The days that followed settled into a simple rhythm. In the mornings, we'd take turns making breakfast, which was usually eggs, toast, and coffee. Eric would then head off to do his maintenance work, while I spent my time wandering the rocky coastline, taking photos or reading. In the afternoons, it'd help him with small tasks around the lighthouse, cleaning windows, organizing tools, or painting. It was satisfying work, the kind that left my mind clear and my body tired. The locals, though few and far between, were friendly in their own quiet way. The woman who ran the general store always had a kind word, and the old man who owned the diner would lean on the counter and tell us stories about the town's history. He mentioned the lighthouse a few times, calling it the Watcher. When I asked why it had that nickname, he shrugged and said, "It's just what folks around here call it." Been standing there since the 1800s, always watching the coast. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just one of those small-town quirks, like the homemade signs for the annual clam bake or the way everyone seemed to know each other's business. One evening, about a week into my stay, Eric and I decided to climb up to the lantern room to watch the sunset. The view was breathtaking. The orange and pink hues of the sky reflected off the water, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. "This place changes you," Eric said quietly. "How so?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "You just start to notice things more. Little things. The way the light hits the water, the way the wind feels different depending on the time of day. It's like the world's telling you something, but you've got to be still enough to hear it." It was an odd thing for him to say, but I chalked it up to the solitude of his job. Out here, it was easy to get lost in your own thoughts. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of the waves outside. The room was dark except for the thin beams of light that occasionally swept across the window from the lighthouse. There was something oddly comforting about it, like a silent guardian keeping watch through the night. At least, that's what I told myself then. It started subtly, as most strange things do. The first incident wasn't dramatic or even particularly alarming at first, but it stuck in my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite ignore. It was late one evening, maybe 4 or 5 days after I arrived. Eric had gone to bed early, had spent the entire day cleaning the lens in the lantern room and patching up a section of the outer wall. I stayed up a little later, flipping through an old paperback he'd found on the shelf in the cottage's tiny living room. The soft glow of a single lamp illuminated the pages, and the room was otherwise quiet, except for the occasional creak of the house settling and the muffled crash of the waves outside. I remember checking the time. 11:43 p.m. I decided to call it a night. I stretched, placed the book on the coffee table, and turned off the lamp. As I made my way toward the bedroom, I noticed something unusual. The sweeping beam of the lighthouse, which I had grown so used to, seemed off. It wasn't as steady as it usually was. The light stuttered slightly, as though it was struggling to complete its regular arc. I paused by the window, watching. The beam faltered again, a momentary flicker that sent an odd shiver down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just an old mechanism in need of repair. Still, I found myself walking to the door, pulling on my boots and stepping outside. The night air was cool and heavy with the scent of salt. The stars were out in full force, a breathtaking display above the lighthouse that stood tall and silent against the night sky. I stood there for a moment, staring up at it, listening to the rhythmic crash of the waves. The beam flickered again. This time, it wasn't just a stutter. It paused completely for several seconds before resuming its slow sweep. "Eric's gonna be pissed," I muttered to myself, thinking about how much he prided himself on keeping the lighthouse in perfect working order. I decided to check on him. The cottage was small, and his bedroom door was only a few steps away. I knocked lightly, not wanting to wake him if he was asleep. "Eric?" No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Finally, I opened the door a crack and peered inside. His bed was empty, the covers rumpled as though he'd left in a hurry. I frowned, a faint unease creeping into my chest. He wasn't in the living room or the tiny kitchen, and I didn't hear the shower running. That left one place, the lighthouse. The beam flickered again as I made my way up the path toward it. The sound of the waves grew louder, and the wind tugged at my jacket as I climbed the short flight of steps to the lighthouse door. It creaked open with a groan, revealing the familiar spiral staircase that wound its way up to the lantern room. "Eric?" I called, my voice echoing faintly. There was no reply, but I heard a faint noise coming from above, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps on the metal stairs. It didn't sound like Eric, though. His movements were usually quick and purposeful, but these footsteps were slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. I hesitated, my hand on the railing. For the first time since it arrived, I felt a strange sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but the air in the lighthouse felt different that night, heavier, colder. I shook it off and started climbing. The creaking stopped when I was about halfway up. I paused, straining my ears, but all I could hear was the faint hum of the lamp above and the distant crash of the waves outside. When I reached the top, I pushed open the heavy door to the lantern room and stepped inside. The light was still sweeping its beam across the ocean, though it flickered again as I entered. The air was warmer up there, carrying the faint scent of oil and metal. "Eric?" I said again, louder this time. The room was empty. I frowned, stepping closer to the lamp. It didn't take an expert to see that something was wrong with it. One of the mechanisms seemed to be catching slightly, causing the flickering effect he'd noticed earlier. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Eric knew this place inside and out, and he'd probably be able to fix it in minutes, but he was nowhere to be found. I decided to head back down and wait for him to show up. As I turned to leave, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement in the glass. My heart skipped a beat, and I whipped my head around, staring into the lantern's reflection. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing on the stairs just outside the lantern room, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. My pulse quickened. I wasn't the kind of guy who scared easily, but there was something about that moment that unsettled me deeply. I shook my head, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or a reflection from the glass. I made my way back down the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the bottom, I stepped outside and looked around, hoping to see Eric somewhere in the distance. The coastline was empty, the only movement coming from the waves crashing against the rocks. I went back to the cottage, locking the door behind me. It felt ridiculous to lock it out here. There wasn't exactly a crime spray in the middle of nowhere, but it gave me a small sense of security. I sat in the living room, waiting for Eric to return, but as the hours ticked by, there was no sign of him. When he finally walked through the door just before sunrise, he looked disheveled and irritated. "Where were you?" I asked, relief and frustration mixing in my voice. "Up at the northern inlet," he replied, pulling off his boots. "There was some damage to the dock after the storm last week." "Why?" I stared at him. "You were gone all night?" He nodded, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah. Thought I told you yesterday it'd be checking it out. Must be slipped my mind." I didn't respond right away. The unease it felt earlier returned in full force, but I kept it to myself. "You okay?" Eric asked, noticing my expression. "Yeah," I said quickly. "Just, the light was flickering. I thought you might have been working on it." His brow furrowed. "The light was flickering?" I nodded. He sighed. "I'll take a look at it later." He didn't seem overly concerned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That flash of movement he'd seen in the lantern room lingered in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder. If Eric had been gone all night, then who or what had been in the lighthouse with me? The morning after Eric returned, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It clung to me like the damp coastal air that seeped through every crack of the cottage. I didn't mention the flash of movement I thought I saw in the lantern room. What would I even say? It felt ridiculous to bring up a vague feeling or a trick of the light when there were more tangible issues to address, like the flickering beam of the lighthouse. Still, I noticed myself glancing over my shoulder more often and pausing whenever I thought I heard the faint creak of footsteps that didn't belong. Eric, true to form, went straight to work on the lighthouse after breakfast. He was meticulous in his routine, moving from task to task with the kind of focus that made me question whether he ever noticed anything strange at all. Meanwhile, I found myself wandering aimlessly around the property, pretending to be busy while my thoughts spiraled. The first odd thing happened just after noon. I was standing on the edge of the rocky shoreline, watching the waves crash against the jagged stones. The tide was coming in, and the water was churning with a ferocity that seemed almost alive. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something floating in the surf, a piece of debris, maybe, or some driftwood washed up from the last storm. But as I turned to get a better look, I froze. It wasn't driftwood. It was a figure, pale and motionless, just beneath the surface. The water rippled and swirled around it, distorting its shape, but I could make out enough. A face, blank and lifeless, staring up at the sky. "Eric!" I shouted, my voice cracking. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the slick rocks. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. The water was empty, save for the frothy whitecaps breaking against the shore. Eric appeared a moment later, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's going on?" I pointed at the water, struggling to find the words. There was someone in the water, right there. He frowned, squinting at the waves. "I don't see anything." "It was there," I insisted. "I swear I saw it." Eric looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You've been spending too much time by yourself," he said finally. "Maybe you need a break. Go into town tomorrow, grab a drink, talk to some people." I wanted to argue, to make him understand that I wasn't imagining things, but the way he dismissed it so easily made me doubt myself. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? That night, the air inside the cottage felt heavier than usual. I tried to convince myself that it was just the humidity, but the sensation of being watched was impossible to ignore. I told myself it was nerves, exhaustion, anything but the creeping realization that something was wrong. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off to sleep, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the shutters, but it was too deliberate, too steady. I lay there, my heart pounding, listening as the sound grew louder. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the front door. "Eric," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned, barely stirring. "Eric, wake up." "What?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Someone's at the door," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" The knocking stopped abruptly, plunging the room into silence. Eric looked at me, his brow furrowed. "I heard it," I said, feeling a surge of frustration. "It was there, I swear." He sighed, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "Fine. I'll check." I followed him as he made his way to the front door, flipping on the light in the living room. He hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and pulling it open. The porch was empty. Eric stepped outside, peering into the darkness. The beam of the lighthouse swept over the landscape, casting long, shifting shadows across the rocks and grass. "Nothing," he said, turning back to me. I didn't know what to say. The sound had been so clear, so unmistakable, but there was no sign of anyone or anything out there. The next few days passed in a haze of unease. The knocking didn't happen again, but the sense of being watched only grew stronger. I caught myself glancing at windows, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. The lighthouse seemed to take on a life of its own, its creaks and groans sounding almost like whispers in the dead of night. Eric seemed unaffected by any of it, going about his work as if nothing had changed. I envied his ability to brush things off so easily, but it also frustrated me. How could he not notice the way the air seemed heavier, or the way the shadows stretched just a little too long? The next major incident happened 3 nights later. I was sitting in the living room, trying to focus on the same paperback I'd been reading before, when the light flickered again. This time, it wasn't just a brief stutter. It dimmed significantly, casting the room into near darkness for several seconds before brightening again. I glanced toward the window, my stomach nodding. The lighthouse beam was stuttering too, its sweeping motion halting erratically. "Eric," I called, standing up. He appeared in the doorway, a wrench in one hand. "What now?" "The light," I said, pointing toward the window. He frowned, walking over to take a look. "Damn it," he muttered. "I thought I fixed that." He grabbed his jacket and headed toward the lighthouse without another word. I hesitated for a moment before following him. The air was cold and still, the kind of quiet that felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The beam of the lighthouse flickered weakly as we climbed the stairs, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the narrow space. When we reached the lantern room, Eric went straight to work, muttering under his breath as he inspected the mechanisms. I stayed near the door, my unease growing with each passing second. Then I heard it. A faint, shuffling sound coming from somewhere below us. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" Eric replied without looking up. "Downstairs," I said, my voice trembling. "There's someone down there." He straightened up, his expression skeptical. "Probably just the wind." "It's not the wind," I insisted. He sighed, setting down his tools. "Fine. Let's check." We made our way back down the stairs, the sound growing louder as we descended. It wasn't just shuffling now. It was a low, guttural noise, like something breathing heavily. When we reached the bottom, Eric hesitated, his hand on the door to the storage room. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, glancing at me. I nodded, though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. He pushed the door open, and for a moment, we both just stood there, staring into the darkness. The room was empty. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving us in deafening silence. Eric stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the shadows, but there was nothing to see, just shelves of tools and supplies. Everything exactly where it should be. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Eric. For the first time since Wet arrived, he seemed genuinely unnerved, though he tried to hide it. Whatever was happening, it was getting worse, and we both knew it wasn't over yet. By the time the fourth night arrived, the tension had become unbearable. It was as though the air itself had grown heavier, pressing down on everything around us. Eric and I barely spoke anymore. The unspoken fear between us made every word feel futile. The lighthouse, which had once stood as a symbol of safety and guidance, now loomed over us like a silent, malevolent presence. That evening, the storm hit. It came out of nowhere, as coastal storms often do, the wind howling with an intensity that shook the cottage. Rain pounded against the windows, and the roar of the waves crashing against the rocks echoed through the night. The lighthouse beam flickered weakly, barely cutting through the thick sheets of rain. Eric and I were sitting in the living room, pretending to read while the storm raged outside. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge what we both felt, that something was about to happen. And then it did. The first sign was the light. It went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Eric cursed under his breath, grabbing his flashlight. "I'll check the generator," he said, his voice tight. "I'm coming with you," I said, already grabbing my coat. He didn't argue. We both knew better than to be alone at this point. The wind nearly tore the door from its hinges as we stepped outside. The rain was icy, soaking through our clothes in seconds. We made our way to the generator shed, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly with every step. When we reached the shed, Eric stopped abruptly. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the storm. He didn't respond. He was staring at the ground in front of the shed, where a series of footprints led from the door to the lighthouse. They were unmistakably human, but they were wrong, too large, too deep, and spaced in a way that suggested a strange, shuffling gait. "Those weren't there earlier," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. We both stared at the footprints for what felt like an eternity before Eric finally snapped out of it. "Let's just get the power back on," he said, unlocking the shed. Inside, everything seemed normal. The generator was still running, humming quietly in the corner. "That doesn't make sense," Eric muttered, shining his flashlight over the equipment. "Maybe it's the wiring," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. Eric nodded, though his expression was grim. "You stay here. I'll check the connections in the lighthouse." "No way," I said. "We're sticking together." He didn't argue. The walk to the lighthouse felt like a journey into another world. The storm seemed to grow stronger with every step, the wind howling like a living thing. The footprints were still there, leading straight to the lighthouse door. When we reached the door, Eric hesitated. "Ready?" he asked, his hand on the handle. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was. He pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The air was freezing, much colder than it should have been. and the sound of the storm seemed to fade, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The footprints continued up the stairs, their wet outlines glistening faintly in the dim light. "Upstairs," Eric said, his voice shaking. We climbed the stairs slowly, the creaking of the wooden steps echoing in the stillness. The footprints led all the way to the lantern room, where the door stood slightly ajar. Eric pushed the door open, and we both froze. The lantern room was empty, at least at first glance. But the beam of Eric's flashlight caught something in the corner, something that made my stomach drop. It was a figure, hunched and shadowy, barely more than a silhouette. It didn't move, didn't react to the light, but I could feel its presence like a physical weight pressing down on me. "Who's there?" Eric demanded, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, its outline shifting and flickering as though it wasn't entirely solid. Then, slowly, it turned toward us. The flashlight beam illuminated its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, there was only emptiness, a void where eyes and a mouth should have been. And yet, I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, boring into me. Eric stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure began to move toward us, its motions jerky and unnatural, as though it were a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. "Run!" Eric shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the stairs. We fled, the sound of the figure's heavy, uneven footsteps echoing behind us. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind and rain battering the lighthouse as we descended. When we reached the bottom, Eric slammed the door shut behind us, leaning against it as though his weight alone could keep whatever was inside from following us. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, his face pale and drenched with sweat. I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to process what we had just seen. And then we heard it. The knocking. It was slow and deliberate, coming from the other side of the door. Eric and I stared at each other, neither of us daring to speak. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it was no longer just a knock, but a pounding, as though whatever was on the other side was trying to break through. "Go," Eric said, his voice barely audible. "Get to the cottage." "I'm not leaving you," I said, my voice shaking. "Just go," he shouted. Before I could argue, the door began to splinter, cracks spreading across its surface. Eric shoved me toward the door to the outside, and I stumbled out into the storm. I ran, the wind and rain blinding me as I made my way back to the cottage. Behind me, I could hear the sound of wood breaking and Eric shouting, but I didn't dare look back. When I reached the cottage, I locked the door and collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The storm raged outside, but all I could think about was Eric and whatever was in that lighthouse. Hours passed before the storm finally began to subside. The wind died down and the rain became a light drizzle. But Eric didn't come back. When the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, I forced myself to return to the lighthouse. The door was wide open, the hinges bent and broken. Inside, the air was still and heavy, and the sense of unease was overwhelming. Eric was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere, no footprints, no tools, nothing. It was as though he had simply vanished. But the footprints leading to the lantern room were still there, wet and glistening in the pale morning light. And the light itself was shining again, its beam steady and unwavering as it swept across the sea. I didn't go up the stairs. I didn't need to. Whatever had taken Eric was still there, and I wasn't about to join him. I left the lighthouse that morning and never went back. Whatever secrets it held, I knew I couldn't face them. Some things are better left alone. I stumbled back into the cottage, soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably, and entirely consumed by the eerie silence that now replaced the chaos of the storm. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, guilt, disbelief, but above all, there was an overwhelming sense of loss. Eric was gone, and I had no idea where he could be. My legs felt weak, and I sank onto the floor, staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment, but the only sound was the faint dripping of rainwater from my coat onto the wooden planks. What had I just witnessed? Was it real, or had the oppressive isolation of the lighthouse driven us to some shared delusion? I sat there, trying to piece it all together. Every step we'd taken, every strange event, every growing unease, it all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. The lighthouse was cursed, haunted, or possessed by something far beyond our comprehension. And now, it had claimed Eric. As the rain eased and the storm clouds began to clear, I knew staying in that cottage was no longer an option. Every shadow, every creak of the wind outside, sent jolts of panic through me. The lighthouse's beam continued its slow, rhythmic sweep across the horizon, steady and unyielding, but I couldn't bear to look at it. That light, which once symbolized safety and navigation, now felt like the cold, watchful gaze of the entity within. I decided to leave immediately. My hands trembled as I packed my belongings, throwing everything into my bag without any care for organization. Every sound made me flinch, the rustling of the trees outside, the distant crash of the waves. Even the zipper of my bag seemed too loud, too sharp in the oppressive quiet. I glanced out the window toward the lighthouse one last time. Its silhouette stood tall and foreboding against the pale dawn sky, and for a moment I thought I saw movement in the lantern room. A shadow shifting slightly. I froze, holding my breath, but the light's rotation continued uninterrupted. I turned away quickly, locking the door behind me even though I knew it was pointless. The path leading away from the lighthouse felt endless as I trudged through the muddy ground, my boots squelching with each step. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the air smelled of wet earth and salt water, but nothing about the scene felt peaceful. It was as though the world itself had absorbed the lighthouse's malevolence, leaving everything tinged with unease. When I finally reached the edge of the property where the gravel road began, I hesitated. A part of me, small but persistent, felt like I was abandoning Eric. Leaving meant accepting that he was gone, and that the thing in the lighthouse had taken him. But what could I do? Go back and face it? Try to save him? I wasn't brave enough for that. I barely had the strength to walk away, let alone confront the darkness in that cursed tower. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling as I tried to get a signal. It was weak, but it was there. I called the Coast Guard first, explaining as calmly as I could that my friend was missing, that something had happened at the lighthouse. I didn't tell them the whole truth. I didn't think they'd believe me, but I gave them enough to send someone to investigate. After the call ended, I sank down onto a nearby rock, my head in my hands, and waited. The hours that followed were a blur. The Coast Guard arrived, along with the local search and rescue team. I watched from a distance as they searched the lighthouse and the surrounding area. They didn't find anything. Not Eric, not his tools, not even the footprints we had seen leading up to the tower. It was as though everything had been wiped clean. One of the rescuers approached me as they wrapped up their search. He was an older man with weathered skin and kind but weary eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with genuine regret. "We didn't find any sign of your friend. The lighthouse is empty." I nodded numbly, my throat too tight to respond. He hesitated, glancing back at the lighthouse before continuing. "You know, there's been talk about that place for years. Strange stories, people disappearing. Most folks around here avoid it. Maybe it's time to let it be." I looked at him, my heart sinking further. "What kind of stories?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated again, as though debating whether to tell me. "They say the lighthouse has a way of calling people, drawing them in. Some think it's haunted. Others think it's something worse. But whatever it is, it's not safe. If I were you, I'd leave this place behind. Don't let it pull you back." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but I couldn't. His words only confirmed what I already knew deep down. Whatever had happened to Eric, it wasn't something I could explain or fight. I left the island that same day, boarding a small ferry that carried me back to the mainland. The sight of the lighthouse growing smaller in the distance should have brought relief, but it didn't. Instead, I felt a strange emptiness, a gnawing sense of guilt and unfinished business. The beam of light continued to sweep across the water, even as the ferry pulled away. Its cold, mechanical rhythm, a haunting reminder of everything I was leaving behind. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadowy figure in the lantern room, felt its gaze piercing through me. I heard Eric's voice, shouting for me to run, followed by the deafening sound of the door splintering. Nightmares plagued me, vivid and relentless, leaving me drenched in sweat and gasping for air. I tried to move on, to bury myself in work and distract myself with the mundane routines of daily life, but the memories refused to fade. I avoided talking about what had happened, even to those closest to me. What could I say? That my friend had been taken by a shadow in a haunted lighthouse? That the Coast Guard found no trace of him? People would think I was crazy, or worse, that I had something to do with his disappearance. But the worst part wasn't the nightmares or the guilt. It was the sense that I was being watched. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, its presence just out of sight. At first, I told myself it was paranoia, a lingering effect of the trauma. But then the strange incident started. Lights flickering in my apartment, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, a faint knocking sound that seemed to come from the walls late at night. And once, just once, I thought I heard Eric's voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I don't know what it means, or if it means anything at all. Maybe I'm losing my mind. Or maybe the lighthouse's reach extends further than I ever imagined. All I know is that Eric is gone, and I will never set foot on that cursed island again. But even as I try to move on, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I had stayed? Would I have found a way to save him? Or would I have disappeared too, another victim of the lighthouse's dark, unyielding grasp? The answers are lost to me now, hidden in the shadows of that solitary tower, its light still sweeping across the sea. And no matter how far I run, I know I will never truly escape the haunting memories of that place and the thing that waits within. It has been 6 months since I left the lighthouse behind, and yet its presence still lingers in my life like a stubborn shadow that refuses to dissipate. Every day I wake up trying to convince myself that the world I live in is rational, that the laws of nature and logic govern all things. But deep down, I know better. My experience on that island shattered my understanding of what is real and what lies beyond the veil of reason. I haven't spoken about Eric's disappearance to anyone outside the initial investigation. Even the authorities seem to have given up. After a few weeks of searching and combing through the island, they officially declared him missing under unexplained circumstances. The report was sterile, devoid of the dread and horror that filled every moment of those final hours. It spoke of storms, unstable terrain, and possible accidents, all wrapped in a neat package designed to close the case. But I know the truth is far more sinister. I left the area and moved inland, far from any coastline, lighthouses, or the crashing waves of the sea. My new home is a small, nondescript apartment in a quiet town where the tallest structures are modest office buildings, and the only water comes from the occasional rain shower. I thought that putting physical distance between myself and the lighthouse would help. It hasn't. The nightmares continue, relentless and vivid. In them, I am always back on the island, standing before the lighthouse. The door is ajar, its hinges creaking in the wind, and the beam of light cuts through the darkness like a blade. Inside, I hear whispers, not words, but a low, unintelligible murmur that seems to emanate from the walls themselves. And then there's Eric. In the dreams, I see him standing in the lantern room, his back to me, staring out at the sea. I call his name, but he doesn't turn. When he finally does, his face is not his own. It's twisted, shadowed, and utterly inhuman. I wake from these dreams gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest, and for a few moments, I don't know where I am. The boundaries between dream and reality blur. and I find myself staring into the darkness of my bedroom, half expecting to see the lighthouse beam sweep across the walls. During the day, I try to keep myself busy. I've taken up a routine of mundane tasks: grocery shopping, cleaning, and walking aimlessly through the streets of my new town. I even started therapy, though I haven't told my therapist the full story. How could I? How do you tell someone that your best friend was taken by a shadow in a haunted lighthouse? That you saw and felt things that defy every rule of logic and science? The sessions help a little. At least they give me a space to voice the guilt and regret that weigh me down like a lead anchor. If I close my eyes, I can still see Eric's face the last time I saw him, his expression caught somewhere between determination and fear as he shouted at me to run. That moment replays in my mind endlessly, and I can't help but wonder, what if I hadn't run? What if I had stayed and fought, tried to help him? Would we both have been lost, or could I have made a difference? It's not just the memories that haunt me. Small, inexplicable things continue to happen, no matter how far I run. Lights flicker in my apartment, even though I've had the wiring checked multiple times. Shadows seem to move in the corners of my vision, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there. And then there are the sounds, soft knocking at the walls, the faint creak of footsteps on the floorboards, and once, a whisper that came from nowhere. At first, I thought I was losing my mind, that the stress and trauma of what happened on the island were playing tricks on me. But then, one evening, something happened that made me question everything again. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when the room was suddenly plunged into darkness. The power outage lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief moment, I saw it. A shadow, tall, thin, and distinctly human-shaped, stood in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the faint light from the street lamp outside. Its head was tilted slightly, as though it were watching me. When the lights flickered back on, the shadow was gone. I sat there, frozen, every hair on my body standing on end. I didn't sleep that night. I've started researching the lighthouse, though information is scarce. There are vague mentions of disappearances and strange occurrences, but nothing concrete. It's as if the island and its tower have been erased from history, their secrets buried beneath layers of time and silence. The few accounts I've found online are fragmented and cryptic, but they all share one common thread. Everyone who spends time near that lighthouse comes away changed, haunted in one way or another. I've also thought about going back. Not because I want to, but because I feel like I have to. The pull of the lighthouse is still there, a nagging sensation at the back of my mind, like a distant voice calling my name. I've resisted so far, but I don't know how much longer I can hold out. There's a part of me that needs answers, closure, something to explain what happened to Eric and what's been happening to me ever since. But then I remember the fear, the overwhelming sense of dread that consumed me that night. I remember the feeling of something watching, waiting, just beyond the edge of perception. And I know that going back would be a mistake, a dangerous, possibly fatal mistake. I've started keeping a journal, writing down every strange event, every dream, every lingering thought about the lighthouse. Maybe it's my way of trying to make sense of it all, or maybe it's just an attempt to hold on to my sanity. Either way, the act of writing helps, even if only a little. As I sit here now, staring at the pages of my journal, I can't help but feel the weight of everything that's happened. Eric is gone, and I will likely never know exactly what became of him. The lighthouse stands silent and unmoving, its beam cutting through the darkness like it has for decades, maybe centuries. And I am left with the knowledge that some places, some things, are beyond human understanding. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing. I will never forget the island, the storm, and the dark presence that took my friend. And no matter how far I run, no matter how much time passes, I will always carry a piece of that place with me, a piece that will never let go. If you're listening to this, if you've made it this far, take my story as a warning. Some places are better left unexplored, some questions better left unanswered. The lighthouse may look like just another relic of the past, a beacon for sailors lost at sea. But I know the truth. It is something else entirely, something ancient, malevolent, and hungry. So, if you ever find yourself near a lonely stretch of coastline and you see a lighthouse standing tall against the horizon, think twice before approaching. Because once you step into its shadow, you may never step out again. This story isn't one I've shared much, but it's been etched into my memory ever since it happened. I still think about those nights and how everything changed after I set foot in that place. It was years ago, but some things, some places, never leave you. It all started in the summer of 2014. I had just graduated college and was at that crossroads of trying to figure out what to do with my life. To earn some money and keep myself busy, I took a temporary night job as a security guard. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The hours were long, sure, but it came with the promise of solitude and plenty of time to think. I figured it would be easy, just sitting at a desk, patrolling now and then, and maybe catching up on some reading. The job was at an abandoned hospital on the edge of town. It used to be one of the largest facilities in the area, but it shut down years ago when a newer, more modern hospital opened. This one had been left to decay. People whispered about it, saying strange things happened there, but I brushed it off as small-town gossip. I wasn't the superstitious type. To me, it was just another job. The hospital itself was a sprawling, hollowed-out shell of what it once was. The walls were cracked, and graffiti marred almost every surface. Broken windows let the cool night air drift through, and the faint scent of mildew was always in the air. My post was in the central lobby, but my duties included walking through the long hallways and checking the perimeter every hour. I wasn't alone on the job either. There was another guy, Ian, who worked the shift with me. Ian had been doing this for months before I joined, and he was the kind of person who just didn't seem fazed by much. He was quiet and reserved, rarely spoke unless I asked him something, and mostly kept to himself. I liked him for that. It meant we didn't have to force awkward conversations to pass the time. Ian and I had a routine. He'd take the first patrol around the building while he stayed in the lobby. Then we'd switch. The hospital was enormous, with 3 floors, a basement, and a maze of hallways that all looked the same. Most of the rooms were empty, with scattered remnants of old equipment or furniture left behind. Some doors were locked, others hung open, creaking on rusted hinges when the wind blew through. At first, the job was uneventful. My shifts were spent pacing the empty halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I carried a flashlight with me, and the beam often revealed dust motes swirling in the air like tiny ghosts. It was quiet, aside from the occasional sound of a rodent scurrying across the floor or the distant creak of the building settling. The nights dragged on, and the monotony became comforting. Ian and I rarely talked, but when we did, it was about trivial things, how boring the job was, the local diner's mediocre coffee, or the weather. I remember one of those early shifts when he mentioned something odd. "You ever hear stories about this place?" he asked as we sat in the dimly lit lobby one night. "Stories?" I replied, glancing up from the book I was reading. "Yeah, people say it's off, haunted or whatever." He shrugged like it was no big deal, but there was something in his tone, a hint of unease. I chuckled and shook my head. Let me guess, kids sneaking in, hearing weird noises, and running out screaming? Ian didn't smile. He just stared at me for a moment before looking away. Something like that. I didn't think much of it then. Every old, abandoned building has its share of those stories. People love to scare themselves. I figured Ian was just trying to pass the time with some local lore. But as the weeks went by, I started noticing little things I couldn't explain. On one of my rounds, I passed an old operating room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the faded tiles on the floor, cracked and covered in grime. There was nothing unusual about it, but as I turned to leave, I thought I saw a shadow move inside. It was quick, like someone darting out of sight, but when I swung my flashlight back, the room was empty. Another night, while I was walking through the second floor, I heard a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but it came from above me. The third floor was supposed to be locked, so I assumed it was just the building settling. Still, it made my skin crawl. I started mentioning these things to Ian, but he just nodded and didn't say much. He seemed almost resigned, like he had heard it all before. Day by day, the hospital began to feel less like a building and more like something alive, watching, waiting. But I pushed those thoughts aside. It was just an old building. There was nothing to be afraid of. Or so I thought. One night, Ian didn't show up for his shift. There was no warning, no message, just an empty chair in the lobby where he usually sat. When I called him, his phone went straight to voicemail. The supervisor didn't know where he was either. It was strange, but I figured he'd had enough of the job and quit without saying anything. That night was my first time working this shift alone. That first night working alone was when everything started to shift. It's one thing to be in a place like that with someone else, even if they're not much for conversation. At least there's another heartbeat in the room, another set of eyes to share the space with. But when you're alone in a place like that, the silence starts to feel oppressive. Every little sound becomes amplified, and you can't help but notice things you'd usually ignore. I remember sitting in the lobby, scrolling through my phone to kill time. The light from the screen was the only thing illuminating the room, aside from the faint yellow glow of the overhead bulbs. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the broken windows and sending shivers through the empty halls. The building groaned every now and then, the way old buildings do, but it learned to tune that out. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. I made my rounds like usual, walking through the long, empty hallways, shining my flashlight into rooms that hadn't seen human life in years. Everything felt normal, or as normal as an abandoned hospital could feel. But as the night dragged on, the atmosphere began to change. It started with a sound. I was walking through the second floor, my flashlight casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. My boots echoed with every step, the only noise breaking the stillness. I was just about to head back to the lobby when I heard it, a faint, muffled noise coming from down the hall. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I stood there, listening, I realized it was something else. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing. I froze, holding my breath to make sure it wasn't just my own echoing back at me. The sound continued, soft but distinct, coming from one of the rooms ahead. My heart started pounding as I slowly moved toward it, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. The noise led me to an old patient room. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the draft. I pushed it open with the toe of my boot, the hinges letting out a low groan. The room was empty, just like all the others, just a bed frame with no mattress and a rusted metal cabinet in the corner. The breathing sound stopped the moment I stepped inside. I stood there for a moment, flashlight scanning the room. My ears strained for any hint of movement, but all I could hear was the faint whistling of the wind through the cracks in the walls. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. Nothing. I checked the cabinet, even looked under the bed frame, but there was nothing there. It didn't make sense. I was sure it heard something. Shaking my head, I stepped back into the hallway, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a draft, or the building settling. It was an old hospital, after all. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got back to the lobby, I tried to shrug it off. I told myself I was overthinking things, letting the eerie atmosphere get to me. I sat down at the desk, flipping through an old logbook that Ian had left behind. It was mostly filled with mundane notes, dates, times, maintenance requests. But one entry caught my eye. 3rd floor, strange noises. No sign of intruder. Will report to supervisor. I frowned. Ian had mentioned the 3rd floor before, but had never gone into detail. He'd been up there a few times during my rounds, and aside from the occasional creak or groan, I hadn't noticed anything unusual. But now, reading that, I felt a chill run down my spine. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but that sound, the breathing, stayed with me. When my shift ended, I went home and tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying the moment I stepped into that room. I told myself it was nothing, just an old building playing tricks on me. The next night, I arrived at the hospital, determined to put it out of my mind. I stuck to my routine, checking each floor and making notes in the logbook. But as the hours went by, I started to notice little things I couldn't explain. One of the doors it locked during my first round was wide open when I passed it again. At first, I thought maybe he'd forgotten to lock it, but the latch was broken in a way that made it impossible to open without force. Later, I found a trail of wet footprints in one of the hallways. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from one room to another. The odd part? It hadn't rained in days, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone else in the building. I felt my nerves starting to fray. Every little sound seemed louder. Every shadow seemed to stretch farther than it should. I began rushing through my rounds, eager to get back to the safety of the lobby. By the 3rd night, I was on edge. The hospital didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. That night, the breathing sound returned. I was on the 3rd floor, near the old maternity ward, when I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from a room, though. It was coming from the hallway itself, just ahead of me. I stopped in my tracks, my flashlight trembling as I swept it over the empty corridor. The sound grew closer, like someone was standing just out of sight. My chest tightened, and I gripped my flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. Just the sound of breathing, slow and steady. I took a step forward, then another, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I moved closer, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening, and I stood there, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. Then, just as I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint whisper, so close it felt like it was right next to me. "Go!" I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the empty hall. There was no one there. My pulse was racing as I stumbled back toward the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste to get away. When I finally made it back to the lobby, I was shaking. I sat down at the desk, trying to catch my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I stayed in the lobby, too afraid to do another round. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a threat. When the morning finally came and my shift ended, I walked out of that hospital with a sense of relief I'd never felt before. But I knew I had to go back the next night. The weeks following that first incident felt like an endless cycle of dread. Every night I returned to the hospital, I was confronted with more and more signs that something was terribly wrong. At first, I thought I was just imagining things, but the frequency of the strange occurrences kept growing, each more unsettling than the last. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to figure out what was going on. The building, with its peeling walls and broken windows, had always felt abandoned, but the silence that once seemed peaceful was now suffocating. It felt as though the very air had become thick with anticipation, every corner of the hospital holding its breath, waiting. I started to dread the long walks through the darkened hallways, the only sound being the echo of my footsteps, louder than usual in the quiet of the building. One evening, as I was walking through the dimly lit corridors of the 2nd floor, I noticed something odd. The walls seemed to be sweating. The moisture beaded on the cracked, faded wallpaper, trickling down in slow, steady streams. The air in that hallway had a damp, musty smell, a scent I hadn't noticed before, despite the hospital's natural staleness. The humidity was stifling, yet it wasn't raining outside. The building itself felt as though it were exhaling, releasing some kind of ancient, hidden breath. As I stood there, trying to make sense of the dampness, the faintest sound broke through, like someone tapping gently on a window. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing there. No one. The hallway stretched out in front of me, empty as ever. My heart raced, the sound of blood pounding in my ears, louder than anything else. I took a slow step forward, cautiously, before my flashlight flickered and went out completely. I cursed under my breath, fumbling to get it back on, but the beam remained dead. Panic began to take hold, but I steadied myself, pulling out a spare flashlight from my jacket pocket. The beam of light shot out, illuminating the path ahead, but something had changed. The shadows in the corners of the hallway seemed longer now, stretching unnaturally. The walls looked different too, as though they were slowly shifting. That was when I heard it again, the slow, rhythmic breathing. This time, it was unmistakable. I wasn't imagining it. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't my own breath echoing in the empty hall. This sound was coming from behind a door halfway down the corridor. My heart pounded as I walked toward it, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Each step felt like it took longer than the last, the darkness pressing in on me. I stopped just before the door. The breathing had stopped too. It was as if whatever it was behind that door was waiting for me. I took a deep breath and opened it slowly, my hands slick with sweat. The room was empty, except for the smell. The air inside was thick, stagnant, like something had been left to rot. The room itself was just like the others, dusty, filled with broken furniture and forgotten medical equipment. But there was something else in here, a shadow just out of the reach of the light, lingering in the far corner. I couldn't make out any details, but I felt its presence, the oppressive weight of it. I quickly backed out of the room, my heart racing. I slammed the door shut, and the sound of the latch clicking felt oddly final. As I stood there in the hallway, my mind screamed at me to leave, to never return. But my feet didn't move. The feeling of being watched had returned, and I couldn't shake it. My body was frozen, caught in some invisible grip, while the sound of that slow, steady breathing seemed to echo around me. It wasn't until the first light of dawn that I finally forced myself to leave the building, barely able to catch my breath as I stepped outside into the crisp morning air. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. What was happening in that hospital? What was behind the breathing? What had I felt in that room? The next night, I came back, determined to face whatever was haunting those halls. The hospital looked even more decrepit in the dim glow of the streetlights outside, its towering silhouette casting long shadows across the parking lot. I told myself I wasn't afraid, that it was just an old building, that I was safe and everything would be fine if I just kept moving forward. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. As I stepped back inside, the air seemed thicker than before, more oppressive. The familiar smell of dust and mildew lingered, but it was different now, heavier, like something had been added to it. The silence felt unnatural, almost suffocating, as if the building itself were holding its breath. I tried to push the feeling aside and went back to my usual rounds. The first few floors seemed normal enough, dim, empty, and lifeless, but as I made my way to the third floor, I heard something I hadn't before. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps echoing behind me. I spun around, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I scanned the hallway, but there was no one there. The silence swallowed the sound of my breathing, leaving me alone in the vast, empty space. I started to move faster, practically running down the hall, desperate to escape that feeling. But the footsteps followed. Every time I quickened my pace, they seemed to match it, maintaining a steady rhythm behind me. My pulse spiked as I rounded the corner to the main stairwell and suddenly stopped. I froze. My heart stopped for a beat, and I could hear it, faintly, coming from somewhere deep within the bowels of the building. A voice. It was low, hoarse, and almost pleading, like a whisper trying to claw its way out of the darkness. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was clear. It was desperate. I couldn't make out the voice, but it sounded like someone calling for help, someone trapped, pleading to be freed. I rushed down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet, my body shaking. The hospital had gone from eerily quiet to unsettlingly alive, as though the very walls were alive, pulsing with energy, hungry for something. The flashlight in my hand felt like a weak defense against whatever was lurking in the corners of the building. When I reached the lobby, I collapsed into the chair, trying to steady my breathing. The thought of leaving crossed my mind more than once, but I couldn't. I was drawn to the hospital, compelled to find out what had happened there. I had to know why it was like this, why it felt so wrong. As the hours dragged on, the strange events didn't stop. The breathing continued. The footsteps followed. I started to hear whispers in the walls, the floors creaking with every shift of the building as though it were alive. The atmosphere in the hospital felt charged, filled with an energy I couldn't comprehend. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. I began questioning my own sanity, wondering if the isolation of the night shifts was finally taking its toll. But deep down, I knew what I was hearing, what I was feeling. It was real. I was getting closer to something. But what? What was it? Something had happened in that hospital, something dark and twisted. I needed to know, needed to understand. And I was starting to feel that I was the one who had to uncover it. But every answer I found only led to more questions. And the more I investigated, the more I realized I wasn't alone. Stay tuned for the next part, where things escalate even further. I'll be diving into the most intense moments of the story yet. If you're hooked, make sure to like and subscribe. Things are about to get a lot worse. The hospital was more alive than ever, each corner seeming to pulse with a hidden force, an energy that weighed down on my chest with every step I took. I had been walking through the halls for hours now, trying to push past the panic that was creeping into my thoughts. My flashlight was barely doing its job anymore, flickering on and off, as if even it was growing tired of this place. But I couldn't leave, not yet. Not until I knew what had happened here, what was still happening. I had to find the truth. The air in the building had grown suffocatingly heavy, and the silence was deafening. The usual creaks and groans of the aging structure seemed amplified, each echo a reminder that I was not alone. But it wasn't just the silence that had shifted. There was something else in the air, a strange hum that seemed to vibrate in the very walls around me, sending shivers down my spine. I had been hearing things for hours, soft whispers, footsteps that didn't belong to me, and the unmistakable sensation that someone or something was just out of sight. But tonight, it felt different. The hospital felt hungry. Every hallway, every room seemed to be waiting for something. Waiting for me. I had checked every floor, every room, but as I approached the old surgical wing, the sense of dread that had been building in my gut intensified. The doors to the surgical suites had been locked for years, and I had always avoided them. But tonight, it felt like I had no choice. There was something in there. Something that had been calling to me, pulling me toward it with a force I couldn't explain. With a trembling hand, I pushed open the doors to the surgical wing. The hallway was dark, the light above flickering intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out towards me. The walls, which had once been white, were now a sickly shade of yellow, the stains of time and decay evident in every corner. I could smell something too, a pungent, metallic scent that made my stomach churn. I moved deeper into the hallway, my flashlight illuminating the rooms one by one. They were all abandoned, but there was a palpable presence here, as though the very air was charged with something I couldn't see, something I couldn't touch. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I walked past each door, the feeling of being watched overwhelming. It wasn't until I reached the last room that I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and I could see my breath misting in the cold air. My flashlight flickered and then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I froze. The silence was unbearable now. I could feel it. Someone was there, standing just behind me. A soft, breathy sound filled the room, and I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing there. Just the cold, empty room. Just the walls closing in around me, the silence pressing against me like a weight. Then, suddenly, a voice cut through the stillness. It was low, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Help me." My heart skipped a beat. The voice came from behind the door, the one I had just passed. The door to the old operating room. I hadn't even noticed it until now, the handle moving slightly, as though someone on the other side was trying to get out. I took a step back, my breath shallow. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and my pulse raced. Was this it? Was this the moment I had been waiting for? The moment I uncovered the truth? I couldn't think. I just acted. Without thinking, I rushed toward the door, wrenching it open with all my strength. The hinges groaned in protest, and as the door swung wide, the coldness inside rushed out to meet me. The room was dark, but I could make out the shape of an old surgical table in the center of the room. The walls were lined with rusted, forgotten medical equipment. But what caught my attention, what made my stomach lurch in horror, was the figure standing in the corner of the room. A figure that shouldn't have been there. It was a person, or what had once been a person. The skin was pulled taut over the bones, pale and sickly, and the eyes, those eyes, were wide and staring, empty, hollow. The figure stood unnaturally still, its body twisted in ways that were not meant to be. And it was smiling, grinning with a twisted, unnatural smile that sent a wave of nausea through me. It was then that I realized what I was seeing wasn't a person at all. It was a corpse, a body long forgotten, left to rot and decay, and now it was alive again, alive in the most terrifying way possible. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to speak, tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs wouldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as the figure in the corner slowly began to move, its head jerking unnaturally toward me, the smile never faltering. The figure took a step forward, its movements erratic, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Then it spoke again, its voice low and guttural, as if dragged up from the depths of a nightmare. "Don't you want to know what happened here?" The words sent a jolt of electricity through my body. I had to know. I had to understand. But the closer I got to the truth, the more I realized that the truth was far worse than anything I could have imagined. The figure reached out, its bony fingers stretching toward me. And in that moment, I felt the hospital itself shift, its walls closing in, the air thick with the weight of everything that had been buried here. I tried to run, to escape, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The figure was right there, just inches from me now, its eyes locked onto mine. Its smile stretched wider, as though it knew something I didn't. And that's when I saw it. The room wasn't just a room anymore. The walls were covered in old, peeling medical charts, but beneath them, the walls were marked with something far darker, scratches, claw marks, deep gouges in the plaster, as if something had been trying to escape, something trapped inside for far too long. The figure let out a low, raspy laugh, and then everything went black. I woke up to a suffocating silence. The first thing I noticed was the cold. My body was shaking, not from the usual fear, but from the deep, biting chill that had settled into my bones. My mind was still reeling from what I had just seen, or thought I had seen, but reality was starting to set in, pulling me back from the edge of whatever madness had been festering inside that hospital. I was lying on the floor of the surgical wing, my back pressed against the cold, dusty tiles. The room was empty now. The figure, whatever it was gone. The air felt different, lighter, as if something had been lifted from the building. But that didn't make me feel any safer. In fact, the emptiness made it worse. The questions that had been swirling in my head, the unanswered ones, felt even more pressing now. What had I really encountered in there? Was it a ghost? A figment of my imagination? Or was it something far worse? Something that had been waiting, hiding in that hospital for years, feeding off the fear of those who came too close. I tried to push myself up, but my legs felt like jelly. The fear had drained every ounce of energy from me. My body ached, and my head was spinning with the remnants of the horrifying visions it just experienced. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't even think straight. I needed to get out, to escape, to put as much distance between myself and this cursed place as possible. But the hallway outside the surgical wing felt different now, too. The tension was gone, replaced by a strange, unsettling calm. It felt almost too calm, like the silence was a trap, waiting to spring. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, the weight of the building pressing down on me, urging me to leave before whatever had been here found its way back. I stumbled down the hallway, trying to ignore the dark corners, the rooms that seemed to stare back at me. It was as if the hospital was alive in its own way, breathing, watching. My flashlight flickered one last time, and I knew I had to keep moving. The power was going to go out completely soon, and I had no intention of being here when it did. The exit door was just ahead, barely visible in the dim light. I thought I could make it, thought I could finally leave this nightmare behind. But as I reached for the door handle, I froze. I heard it. That soft, breathy voice again, the one that had whispered in the darkness earlier. Leave, before it's too late. I didn't even flinch. I had heard enough whispers, enough cries for help, to know that I wasn't going to fall for it this time. There was nothing left for me in that hospital. No answers, no closure. Just a dark void that had consumed everything that once stood in its place. I had to leave, and I had to leave now. Without another thought, I threw open the door, the hinges screeching in protest. The outside world was bright in comparison, but the light felt strange too, almost blinding. I stepped into the fresh air, the cool wind hitting my face like a slap. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the ground. For a brief moment, I thought I was free. The hospital was behind me, and the world outside was peaceful. But as I took a few steps away from the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I turned around, half expecting to see the hospital looming in the distance, but it was gone. I blinked. The building had vanished, as though it had never existed. The empty lot where it had stood now stretched out before me, barren and abandoned. There was nothing left. No hospital, no ghostly figure, no whispers. Just an empty space, the ground covered in weeds and forgotten memories. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the hospital had been, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was I losing my mind? Had it all been a nightmare? Or had I really encountered something terrible, something that the world wasn't ready to know? The truth was, I had no answers. I didn't even know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that whatever had happened inside that hospital was still with me, lingering in the back of my mind, and the terror that had consumed me was never going to truly fade. I walked away from the lot, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I had just endured. But with every step, I could feel it, feel the pull of the darkness that had followed me out. It was waiting, just beyond the edge of my vision. The whispers might be gone, but the fear remained. And I knew, in some dark corner of my mind, that this was far from over. As I left that cursed hospital behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. The further I walked away, the more I tried to convince myself that everything had been a hallucination, a product of my mind unraveling under the pressure. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had happened in that place. Something real. Something that couldn't be explained. The next few days were a blur. I tried to move on, go back to normal life. I went to work, met with friends, and even went through the motions of eating and sleeping. But my mind was never far from that hospital. Every time I closed my eyes, the images flooded back. The darkness of the hallways, the whispered voices, the figure in the shadows. It felt like I couldn't escape. I knew that it'd never be the same again. That part of me that once believed in rational explanations, logics, and facts was now gone, replaced with a deep, knowing uncertainty. What had happened there? What was it I had encountered? It's funny how the human mind works. We're quick to deny the things we can't understand, to rationalize the unexplainable. But some things, some experiences, don't fit into neat categories. There are moments in life that defy all explanation, and once you've lived through them, you can't unknow them. I visited the site of the hospital again, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what I had seen. But when I arrived, it was nothing but an empty lot. The ruins of the hospital, where once there had been walls, rooms, and hallways, had completely vanished. Not a trace remained of the building that had once stood there so prominently. The lot was overgrown with weeds, the grass tall and thick, as if the place had never existed in the first place. I checked with the local authorities. They had no record of any hospital in that area. In fact, the lot I was pointing to, right where the hospital had stood, had always been empty, according to their records. That was when the panic set in. Had I imagined it all? Had I somehow conjured the entire ordeal in my mind, fabricating the memories of those terrifying events? Was my mind playing tricks on me, or had something darker and more sinister truly taken place? I couldn't tell anymore. The weeks passed, and I tried to move forward, trying to push the experience to the back of my mind. I told myself it was over. But then, one night, I had a dream. A vivid, almost real dream. In it, I was back inside that hospital, walking down those familiar, decrepit hallways, the darkness pressing in on all sides. And there, standing at the end of the corridor, was the figure, the same one I had seen that night. The same chilling presence that had haunted me. The figure didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow, unblinking eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. I couldn't move. And then, as if it had been waiting for me to understand, it raised a finger, pointing directly at me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The nightmare felt too real, too much like the events I had lived through. But it was just a dream, wasn't it? No, something was wrong. Something I couldn't explain. In the months that followed, I tried to find peace. I moved to a new town, away from the memories, away from the unsettling feelings that still clung to me. But no matter where I went, the shadows remained. I'd sometimes feel them, cold, heavy, like they were following me, watching me, waiting. The figure, the voices, they were always just out of reach, slipping through the cracks of my mind. I learned to live with it, this constant companion of dread, this nagging sensation that I was never truly alone. And I began to wonder, what if the hospital hadn't just been a place? What if it was something more, something that existed in between, where the boundaries of reality and the supernatural blurred? A place where those who entered could never truly escape. Maybe some things are meant to remain hidden. Some things are too dangerous to uncover, too terrifying to face. And perhaps, for those who have seen them, there is no return. But still, I often find myself staring at the empty spaces, wondering if it was all just a trick of the mind, or if there's something out there, waiting, watching. I don't know if it'll ever get answers, and part of me isn't sure I want to. Sometimes it's better to live in the silence, to accept that some things are beyond understanding. It all started during the summer of 2016. I had just finished my first year of university, and a group of friends and I decided to take a break from our hectic lives and go on a hiking trip. We wanted to escape the mundane and connect with nature for a few days. There were 5 of us in total, me, 2 girls, and 2 other guys. We weren't an adventurous group by any stretch, but we thought a little weekend hike would be a nice change of pace. No one had any particular experience in hiking, but we were all fit and outdoorsy enough to handle a few days in the woods. We had decided on a place that was far from the city, a quiet, isolated spot known for its beautiful scenery and quiet trails. The area had been recommended to us by a local guide who promised that it was peaceful, serene, and filled with breathtaking views of nature. It sounded perfect for what we needed, a chance to unwind and escape the noise of everyday life. The day we set out, the weather was perfect. A warm breeze blew through the trees, and the sun was shining, casting soft rays through the branches. I remember the day so clearly, almost too clearly. It felt like the calm before the storm. We packed our bags, loaded up the car, and drove off for what we thought would be an easy, enjoyable getaway. When we arrived at the trailhead, the forest seemed normal enough. Just a bunch of towering trees, the faint sounds of birds chirping, and the occasional rustling in the bushes. As we set off down the path, everything felt perfect. We were excited, joking around, taking pictures, and just soaking in the fresh air. But as the hours passed, something strange started to happen. It was subtle at first, easy to brush off. We all had our own little thoughts about it, but no one wanted to say anything out loud. The deeper we went into the forest, the quieter it became. Not just in the sense that there were fewer sounds, but it felt like the forest itself was absorbing all the noise. It was as though the air around us had thickened, and it became harder to hear each other. It didn't help that the path we were on was getting more and more isolated, with fewer signs of human presence. We had passed a few other hikers in the beginning, but now there was nothing. Not a single person in sight. It was just us and the vast, looming trees surrounding us. There was an odd sense of stillness in the air that we couldn't shake, as if the forest was waiting for something. We camped near a small clearing as the day turned to evening, setting up our tents and preparing dinner. It was beautiful, but as night began to fall, that feeling of isolation only grew stronger. The sounds of the forest around us started to feel more like whispers, and the flickering of the campfire seemed to cast shadows that moved in strange ways. The first night passed without anything too strange, but something felt off. We couldn't pinpoint what it was, but it lingered in the back of our minds. The unease. The forest that once seemed peaceful now felt like something was watching, waiting. We joked about it at first, laughing it off, but deep down, we all felt it. Something wasn't right, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding on something far older, far more powerful than us. But it was only day one, right? Surely, we had no reason to worry. We had planned to stay for a few more days, and we decided to push ahead with our hike the next morning, ignoring the unease gnawing at us. We kept moving, thinking that maybe the odd feeling would just go away if we kept walking, kept talking, and kept our minds busy. It was then that we began to notice the strange things. We had been hiking for several hours that second day, with the path becoming increasingly narrow and tangled as we ventured deeper into the forest. By mid-afternoon, the sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like the fingers of some unseen entity. It was around this time that we first noticed something was off. At first, it wasn't obvious. It wasn't like the trees suddenly started whispering or the ground started shifting beneath our feet. It was something more subtle, something that took us a moment to fully grasp. It began when we stopped for a break. We had found a small clearing just off the main trail, the ground soft with moss and the air thick with the smell of earth and pine. The others were chatting and drinking water, while I wandered a bit off to the side, stretching my legs. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a bird, or maybe a squirrel darting between the trees. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. Just the same forest, still and silent. I shrugged it off, blaming the fatigue of the hike for messing with my senses. It had been a long day after all, and my mind was starting to wander. But as I turned back toward the group, I caught the same flash of movement again. This time, it was clearer, a figure, no taller than a man, but dressed in something dark, moving quickly between the trees. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know whether I should call out or run toward it, but I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. I wanted to call out to the others, but part of me was afraid to speak, afraid to break the fragile calm of the moment. After all, I was probably just imagining things, right? I turned around to see if anyone else had noticed anything. The others were still chatting away, oblivious to what I had seen. But as I glanced at them, I caught a glimpse of something else, something just as strange. One of the girls, Mia, was looking at me, her face pale, her eyes wide. She had a strange expression on her face, as if she had seen something too, but wasn't sure if she should say anything. I walked back to the group, trying to push the strange vision from my mind. But when I reached Mia, she turned to me and whispered, "Did you see that?" I froze again, my pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" Something moved between the trees over there," she said, her voice shaky. "I thought it was one of you, but no one's over there." I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want to sound crazy, but the look in Maya's eyes made me realize that I wasn't the only one who had seen something. We both exchanged nervous glances, but before I could say anything, one of the guys, Luke, spoke up. "All right, what's going on?" he asked, looking at both of us suspiciously. "You two look like you've seen a ghost." "It's nothing," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." Mia thought she saw something, but we're fine. Luke didn't seem convinced, but Mia and I didn't press the issue. It was probably just a trick of the light, right? We were deep in the forest, far from any sort of civilization. Our senses were probably playing tricks on us. I tried to brush it off, but the unease lingered, like a weight pressing down on my chest. We decided to continue on the trail, pushing forward despite the growing sense of discomfort. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The woods felt different. It wasn't just the quiet either. It was something else, something that was hard to explain. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was holding its breath. The trees, once standing tall and proud, now seemed to loom over us, casting long, twisted shadows. At one point, we passed a small stream, the sound of water trickling over rocks filling the silence. It should have been soothing, but it only added to the eerie atmosphere. The water was strangely dark, almost black, as though it had absorbed the forest's unease. The further we went, the stranger things seemed to get. I kept catching flashes of movement at the edge of my vision, figures darting behind trees or stepping quickly between the shadows. Each time I turned to look, there was nothing there. The others seemed oblivious to it all, carrying on with their conversations, but I could see that Mia was just as jumpy as I was. Every now and then, she would glance nervously around, her eyes darting from tree to tree. We made camp just before dusk, setting up our tents in a small, secluded area near a thick cluster of trees. It was quieter here than anywhere else we had been, the sounds of wildlife almost completely absent. The silence was oppressive, hanging over us like a cloud. As we settled around the fire, I noticed something odd. There were no insects. No buzzing of mosquitoes or chirping of crickets. It was as if the forest itself had gone still. We sat around the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the ground, but none of us said much. It felt like the air had thickened, and it was hard to breathe. Mia, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "I don't like it here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong." The others looked at her, but no one said anything. We all felt it. The same strange, unsettling feeling that had been gnawing at us since we first arrived. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. That night, as I lay in my tent trying to fall asleep, I heard something. It was faint at first, just a rustling in the leaves, like something moving through the underbrush. But it wasn't the usual sound of animals. This was different. It was deliberate, slow, as if someone was walking through the forest, avoiding the branches and leaves to make no sound. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the noise continued. Soft steps, then nothing. Just as I was about to drift off, the noise started again, closer this time. I sat up, my heart pounding. My first thought was that it was someone else, maybe another hiker who had wandered off the trail. But then I remembered we were far from any other trail. There were no other hikers out here. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously unzipped the tent, stepping outside. The forest was as still as it had been all day. No movement, no sound. Just the cold night air brushing against my skin. I looked around, shining the light through the trees, but there was nothing. Just the darkness stretching out before me. The next morning, we all gathered around the campfire, our faces pale and tired. We hadn't gotten much sleep, and the weight of the previous night hung over us. But no one mentioned the sounds. No one said anything about what we had all heard. We didn't talk about it then, but we all knew that something wasn't right. Something was in the forest with us, watching us, waiting for us to let our guard down. The days that followed were a slow unraveling of our peace, a gradual descent into the unsettling. At first, we tried to convince ourselves that the strange occurrences were just coincidences. A snap of a twig in the distance, a flash of movement in the corner of our eyes. But after a while, these things piled up, each one stacking on top of the other, until it became impossible to deny. We had set off again the next morning, our feet crunching against the forest floor, the sound of our steps barely audible over the thick quiet that enveloped us. The air was unusually thick, heavy with moisture and something else, something almost metallic, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, following our every move. It started as a faint sense of being observed, nothing overt, just the subtle feeling of eyes on the back of my neck. I tried to brush it off, but it was there, a constant undercurrent of unease. Every so often, it glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the tree line, but there was nothing. The forest was as still as ever. By midday, the discomfort had only grown. We found ourselves stopping more often, checking the trail, as if we were waiting for something or someone to appear. It wasn't normal to feel so, on edge in a place like this. The forest should have been peaceful, a retreat from the world. But there was something wrong here, something that was starting to eat away at our sense of safety. We came to a small clearing, a place where the trees opened up, and a faint breeze could actually be felt. The ground was soft with damp earth, and the air smelled of wet leaves and moss. The sun broke through the canopy, casting pale patches of light across the forest floor. It seemed serene, but the strange weight of silence hung heavy. As we set down our packs and took a short break, something caught my attention. A noise, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It sounded like footsteps, not the random scurry of animals, but the heavy, deliberate tread of a person walking just out of sight. I glanced over at Mia, and she had heard it too. Her face had gone pale, her hand gripped tightly around her water bottle as she looked around nervously. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice strained. I nodded. "Yeah, but there's no one else here." Mia opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, the noise came again, a slow, rhythmic step, followed by another, and another. This time, we all stopped what we were doing, straining to listen. The noise wasn't close, but it was there, somewhere deeper in the woods, somewhere just out of sight. "Should we check it out?" Luke asked, his voice low. He was usually the brave one, the first to joke about things, but there was no humor in his voice now. "No," Mia said quickly, her eyes wide. "It's probably nothing, just an animal." But there was something about the sound that didn't fit. Animals didn't walk that deliberately. They didn't make footsteps like that. We spent the next few minutes in a tense silence, our senses on high alert. I wanted to suggest we leave, that we should head back to the camp and just get out of here, but I didn't say it aloud. I wasn't sure if I was the only one feeling this way, but I felt trapped, like we were being drawn deeper into something we didn't understand. It wasn't long before we moved on, the uneasy feeling still lingering in the pit of my stomach. We continued along the path, our steps faster now, as though we were hurrying away from something without even realizing it. But the forest had a way of twisting around us, like a maze, the path never quite leading where we thought it would. As we walked, I caught another flash of movement, this time from the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but again, there was nothing, just the same old trees, the same overgrown underbrush. My breath quickened, but I told myself it was just the stress of being out here. The wilderness has a way of playing tricks on your mind. Later that evening, as we set up camp for the night, the tension had only escalated. Everyone was more jumpy, constantly glancing over their shoulders, checking the perimeter of our camp like we expected someone, or something, to emerge from the shadows. Even the fire, which had been crackling merrily when we arrived, now seemed to flicker uneasily, casting odd, shifting shadows that danced across the trees. I sat by the fire, my eyes scanning the dark woods around us, the night air cool against my skin. The woods felt different at night, alive in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. The leaves rustled faintly in the wind, but there was something else, something that stood out, something that didn't belong. A sound, a low groan, like the creaking of an ancient tree, but coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't the wind. It was like the forest itself was groaning in pain. I looked around at the others, but they didn't seem to notice. Luke was poking at the fire with a stick, while Mia and the others were talking in hushed tones. But their words didn't reach me. My mind was focused on the sound, trying to make sense of it, trying to pinpoint its source. But it came again, louder this time, a strange, almost guttural groan that seemed to echo through the trees. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all stood in silence for a moment, listening. The night was eerily still, save for that low groaning sound that seemed to vibrate in the air. I could feel my heart racing, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Whatever it wasn't natural, and it wasn't an animal. We spent the next few hours in a tense silence, sitting around the fire, trying to ignore the creeping dread that clung to the edges of our minds. We kept hearing strange sounds, branches snapping in the distance, twigs breaking underfoot, and the occasional low moan coming from the depths of the woods. But no matter how many times we shined our flashlights into the dark, there was nothing there. Around midnight, as we sat in the dark, the fire barely crackling anymore, I heard something else. This time, it was a voice. A whisper, so faint that I wasn't sure if I had heard it or if it was just my imagination. I leaned in closer, straining to hear. "Help me!" The voice was so soft, so distant, it might have been the wind or the trees moving. But the chill that ran down my spine told me otherwise. I turned to the others, but no one had heard it. They were all looking at me now, waiting for me to say something. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice tight with fear. The night had descended upon us like a weight, heavier than it had been before. The air was thick with unease, thick enough that even the breeze seemed reluctant to move through the trees. Our campfire was nearly spent, only a few faint embers remaining as we huddled around the dying light. The silence between us felt heavier now, a quiet so profound it pressed against our chests. I could feel the oppressive presence of something, watching us from just beyond the reach of the firelight, though every time I looked toward the trees, I saw nothing. It was the sort of silence that fills your ears with the loudest sound, your own heartbeat pounding in your chest, as if it might explode. Luke, always the brave one, had gotten up about an hour ago to go check the perimeter, but the minutes stretched on, and he hadn't come back. The others hadn't seemed concerned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Something had shifted in the woods since the groan we had heard earlier. The forest had taken on a different tone, almost as if it had become a living thing, watching us, waiting for something. "Where's Luke?" Mia asked, her voice trembling slightly. She was sitting next to me now, her arms wrapped around herself as though to ward off some unseen chill. "I don't know," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. "He should have been back by now." Mia looked over at the others, Jenna, Ben, and Ethan, who were now staring into the woods as well, their expressions taut with fear. They, too, had sensed the change in the air. A few minutes later, we stood up, our eyes scanning the darkness that surrounded our camp, each of us unwilling to break the silence first. "Maybe he's just messing around," Ben said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He wasn't looking at any of us as he spoke. His eyes were fixed on the edge of the forest, where the trees swayed eerily in the windless night. A few seconds later, Maya's soft gasp cut through the stillness. "Did you hear that?" I didn't need to hear it again to know what she meant. There was something else out there, something in the distance that wasn't supposed to be. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the darkened trees. I felt my heart skip in my chest. We were no longer alone. "I'll go look for him," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, though it felt louder than I wanted it to be. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam shaky as I turned it toward the darkness ahead. "No," Mia said, her hand grabbing my arm tightly. "You don't know what's out there. We should wait for him to come back." But I couldn't wait. I couldn't sit still and listen to that sound any longer. Something in me had snapped, and I had to find Luke before. A blood-curdling scream shattered the night, a sound so raw and full of terror that it made the air seem to freeze. It was Luke. Without thinking, I ran toward the sound. The others followed, though none of us spoke. The only sounds were our hurried footsteps and the cracking of twigs beneath our boots. My flashlight bounced erratically in front of me as I sprinted, the beam illuminating only a small patch of the forest at a time. But I couldn't stop. Luke needed us. I wasn't sure how far I had gone when I heard it again. This time, the scream was cut short, replaced by a chilling, unearthly sound, something between a growl and a scream, a voice so distorted it couldn't possibly be human. It echoed through the woods, swirling around us, coming from every direction at once. I stopped, frozen in my tracks, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There was something here with us, something that wasn't Luke, something far worse. "Luke," I called out, my voice shaking with fear. But the answer was silence. Then came the sound of something dragging itself through the underbrush. Something large. "Over here," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. I saw something move. I turned to look at her, but I couldn't focus. The darkness in front of me was closing in, and I had to fight to keep myself from succumbing to the panic creeping up my spine. Then I saw it. A shape, a figure, moving slowly just outside the reach of my flashlight. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far for its body. Its form was distorted, like it was made of shadows, something between a man and something else, something monstrous. The air around it seemed to warp and pulse, as though the forest itself was alive and reacting to its presence. I blinked, and it was gone. I turned to look at the others, but they had seen it too. Ben, normally so composed, was breathing heavily, his face pale and drawn. Jenna was standing close to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I saw it," Ethan gasped, his voice hoarse. "What was that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But I think it's been here the whole time, watching us." Suddenly, we heard another scream, a short, strangled cry, followed by the sound of something large and heavy crashing through the woods. Luke. It had him. Without another word, we ran toward the noise, adrenaline pushing us forward. We couldn't stop now. But the deeper we went into the forest, the more the woods seemed to close in on us. The trees seemed to bend in unnatural ways, blocking our path, twisting toward us like fingers reaching from the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, and the ground beneath our feet was soft, uneven, as if it were swallowing us whole. We rounded a corner, and then, in the clearing ahead, we saw him. Luke! But it wasn't Luke anymore. He was lying on the ground, his body contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. His eyes were wide open, staring into the sky, but they were empty, blank. And surrounding him was the thing, the shape. It stood over him, its arms raised, as though it had just finished some terrible ritual. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were dark, empty pits, and it turned slowly toward us, its face twisting into a grotesque mockery of a smile. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The air around us crackled with energy, and I could feel it pushing in on us, crushing us, as if the forest itself was alive and angry. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the shadows, leaving only the stillness behind. The night was quiet again, too quiet. All that remained was the memory of what we had just witnessed, the terror we had seen, the unspeakable thing that lurked just out of reach. The silence that followed the creature's disappearance was suffocating. I stood there, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps, as the reality of what we had just witnessed began to settle in. My legs felt like jelly, the strength draining out of me as I struggled to understand what had happened. Luke's lifeless body lay in the clearing, twisted and broken in ways I couldn't comprehend. Mia was the first to move, her shaking hands reaching out to grip my arm. Her voice was barely audible, a whisper lost in the oppressive stillness of the forest. We need to leave. Now." The words barely registered in my mind. It felt like the world was moving too slowly around me, as though I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The image of Luke, twisted and empty, haunted my mind. But Maya's grip tightened on my arm, pulling me back into the present. She was right. We couldn't stay here. I turned to look at the others. Ben and Jenna stood in a daze, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shock. Ethan, who had been just as terrified as the rest of us, was the first to break the silence. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice hoarse and panicked. "We need to get out. Right now." "Yeah," Ben muttered, his voice shaky. "Let's just go." But as we turned to leave, something changed. The air around us seemed to shift, the temperature dropping suddenly. A chill that wasn't natural wrapped itself around us, seeping into our bones, paralyzing us with fear. The forest seemed to groan, as though it were alive and aware of our departure. The trees loomed over us like silent sentinels, watching our every move. And then we heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the woods. The sound that had haunted us all night, the one we had been trying to outrun. It was getting closer. Panic surged through me, my heart racing as the dread that had been building in the pit of my stomach erupted into full-blown terror. I looked around, searching for the source, but all I saw was darkness. It was as if the very forest itself was closing in on us, surrounding us with its unseen presence. "We need to move," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. But the words barely left my mouth before the air seemed to change again, thick with the weight of something invisible, something powerful. And then I saw it. The shape, the figure that had haunted us since the first scream. It wasn't far now, moving through the trees with a fluid, unnatural grace. "We're not alone," Mia whispered, her eyes wide with terror as she gripped my arm tighter. I turned to face her, but before I could say anything, Ben bolted. His fear took over, and he sprinted through the trees, the sound of his footsteps quickly swallowed by the forest. "Ben, no!" I screamed, but it was too late. He was gone. There was a moment of stunned silence before the realization hit us all. Ben was out there, alone in the woods, running from something none of us understood. I could feel the weight of that fear settle over me like a crushing weight. We had to go after him, but every instinct screamed at me to turn and run in the opposite direction to get as far away from this place as possible. Maya's hand tightened around mine, her face pale with fear. "We can't leave him out there," she said, her voice trembling. I nodded, swallowing hard, trying to push aside the panic that was rising in my throat. "We have to find him." And so we moved. Each step felt like a weight dragging us down. The trees closed in around us, the darkness growing more oppressive with each passing moment. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the ground beneath our feet soft and uneven. The forest seemed to shift and change, as though the very land was trying to swallow us whole. We called for Ben as we moved deeper into the woods, our voices swallowed by the night. There was no response, just the soft rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig breaking underfoot. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that eyes were upon us from the shadows, unseen but ever present. And then, just as I thought we couldn't go any further, we found him. Ben was lying on the ground, his body twisted unnaturally, just like Luke's. His eyes were open, staring blankly into the dark sky. There was no sign of life in him, no trace of the person we had known. I stumbled back, the world spinning around me as the full weight of what had happened crashed down on me. We were not going to make it out of this forest. "We need to go," Mia whispered, her voice trembling with grief. "Now." But we couldn't leave Ben there. We couldn't leave him like Luke. The thought was unbearable. But we had no choice. We turned and began to move, faster now, with a sense of urgency that pushed us forward, past the twisted trees and the heavy air. The forest seemed to fight us every step of the way. The trees grew thicker, more tangled, the ground uneven beneath our feet. It was as if the woods were trying to keep us trapped, to keep us here forever. But we kept moving, pushing through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that tore at our clothes, the sharp rocks that cut at our feet. It felt like hours had passed since we had found Ben. My body was sore, my mind numb with fear and exhaustion. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. I didn't know if we were going the right way or if we were only getting deeper into the heart of the forest. Then, suddenly, I saw it, the edge of the woods, the faint glow of light in the distance. I pushed myself harder, my heart racing with a mixture of hope and fear. We were so close. We couldn't stop now. And then, we were out. The trees gave way to open land, and I felt the weight of the forest lift off my shoulders. The air felt lighter here, though still thick with tension. We were outside the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us, watching from the shadows. We didn't speak as we walked away from the woods, the silence between us thick with grief and fear. We had made it out, but at what cost? It's been months now since we escaped the forest. I can still feel it, the weight of that night hanging over me like a shadow, always there, just out of reach, but never truly gone. The others and I went our separate ways after we left the woods, each of us carrying our own private fears and horrors. We had all been touched by that place, and I don't think any of us were ever the same after what happened. Mia moved away shortly after. She couldn't stay in the area anymore. The memories were too much for her, the nightmares too vivid. I can't blame her. If I could leave, I would too. But I can't. Something keeps me here, tied to this place, to the events that happened that night. I've tried to forget. I've tried to go back to normal, to live my life as I did before. But the memories of the forest, of what happened to Luke and Ben, are always there, lurking in the back of my mind. There's a constant heaviness in my chest, like in waiting for something, and I don't know what it is. I try not to think about it. I try to go about my daily life, doing normal things, work, errands, the mundane tasks that make up most of our existence. But it's hard. Every creak of the floorboard, every gust of wind that rattles the windows, brings me back to that place. I can hear the footsteps again, just like I did in the forest, slow and deliberate, as if something is following me, always just out of sight. It's not just the sounds, though. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is still and quiet, I can feel it. I don't know what it is, whether it's the forest itself or something else, something darker. But it feels like it's there, in the corners of the room, watching me. Every shadow, every flicker of movement makes me jump, makes my heart race with that same primal fear I felt in the woods. I tried reaching out to the others after we parted ways. I needed to talk about it, to understand what happened, but no one replied. No one returned my calls. No one answered my messages. I don't know where they went, or if they even want to be found. But I understand. Sometimes, silence is the only way to deal with things that can't be explained, things that shouldn't have happened. The worst part is that I'm not sure if I'm even alone. I sometimes hear strange noises when I'm alone in my apartment, scratching sounds at the door, faint whispers that disappear when I try to focus on them. It's always just a little too much to ignore, a little too real to dismiss as my imagination. Maybe it's all in my head. Maybe I've gone mad from what happened that night. Or maybe the forest is still out there, waiting. I don't know. But I do know one thing. It'll never be able to escape it. It's part of me now, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks in the world just beyond our sight. I've stopped going into the woods. I haven't even gone close to them, not even for a moment. The idea of stepping foot into those trees again fills me with a terror I can't explain. But it's not just the woods that scare me. It's everything. It's the realization that whatever we encountered that night wasn't just a figment of our imaginations. It was real. And whatever it was, it hasn't gone away. The worst part is that I can't shake the feeling that the forest knows me now, that it remembers me, that it's waiting for me to return. It was a late spring evening, the air thick with humidity as I checked into a hotel located on the edge of a quiet town, a place where I had planned to spend the night during a long road trip. The kind of hotel that looked old-fashioned but inviting from the outside, with its brick walls covered in creeping ivy and the faint scent of history in the air. It seemed perfect for a restful evening after a long day behind the wheel. Nothing too fancy, just a small, unassuming establishment that would provide a roof over my head and a good night's sleep. The hotel was called the Ashton House, and from the moment I entered, I knew there was something off about the place. It wasn't the decor, it was simple enough, with old paintings hanging on the walls and low lighting that gave it a cozy, albeit slightly dated atmosphere. But there was something about the air, something dense, almost suffocating. The receptionist, a woman with pale skin and an emotionless gaze, handed me a room key without a word, her fingers icy to the touch as they passed it to me. I tried not to think too much of it. After all, it was just a hotel, right? I was here to rest, so I forced myself to smile and made my way to the room. I had been on the road for hours, and the last thing I needed was to let my mind wander. As I walked down the long, narrow hallway, my footsteps echoed in the silence, only broken by the occasional creak of the floorboards. The hotel had that eerie stillness to it, as if it had been standing for decades, untouched by time or change. The wallpaper was peeling in some places, and the lights above flickered occasionally, casting long shadows on the walls. But nothing that made me stop. Nothing that made me feel truly alarmed. My room was on the third floor. I fumbled with the key for a moment before finally unlocking the door. Inside, the room was a bit too quiet, but nothing out of the ordinary. It had the typical furniture, a bed with a floral comforter, a wooden wardrobe, a small desk. The carpet beneath my feet was thick and slightly worn. I tossed my bags on the bed and sighed in relief. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. I set about unpacking, throwing my clothes into the small dresser. Everything felt normal, even if there was a strange heaviness in the air that I couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the silence that made the atmosphere feel oppressive. The hotel had an odd sense of abandonment, but I pushed the thought aside. After all, I was just one guest among many, right? The kind of place where time seemed to stretch endlessly. I decided to explore the building before turning in for the night. There had to be a small bar or common area, a place where I could grab a drink before heading to bed. As I walked through the hotel, I noticed something peculiar. There was no one around. Not a single soul in the halls. It was as if the hotel was entirely empty, and I was the only one there. The silence was unnerving, but I continued on. I eventually made my way to what appeared to be the dining area. There was a long wooden table with a few chairs scattered around, and an old chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals catching the dim light. I sat down at one of the tables, looking around. It was odd, but not completely unsettling. The place had a kind of charm, even if it did feel a little stuck in time. The more I looked around, though, the more the sense of unease grew. It wasn't the building itself, but the feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, but after a few moments, I couldn't shake the sensation. My eyes darted around the room, scanning for any sign of movement. Nothing. The stillness was suffocating, and I quickly realized I wanted to be out of there. I returned to my room, locked the door behind me, and collapsed onto the bed. The room was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. It should have been a peaceful night. I was tired and ready to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt colder, the silence more oppressive. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone to knock, but no one came. As I lay there in the darkness, I felt my eyelids grow heavy. The pull of sleep was strong, and I welcomed it. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard a soft creak from somewhere in the hallway. I froze. It wasn't the wind. No, this was different. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. They grew louder as if someone was walking toward my room. My breath hitched in my chest as I strained to listen. The steps stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, hoping whoever it was would move on. But they didn't. I sat up, the sheets rustling beneath me, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps didn't retreat, they just stood there, outside my door. I couldn't make out any other sound, no muffled voices, no whispers, just the footsteps, relentless, as if they were waiting. This was where my experience at the Ashton house truly began. The morning after the footsteps outside my door, I woke up to the sound of the hotel's old clock tower chiming. I hadn't slept well, and my body ached from the tension of the night before. The cold room felt heavier than I remembered, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. The sunlight trickled in through the curtains, casting faint shadows across the room. For a moment, everything seemed calm, as if nothing had happened. But as I sat up and rubbed my eyes, I noticed something strange. The bedside lamp that I had turned off before going to bed was now on. It flickered weakly, casting a dim, almost sickly light across the room. My immediate reaction was disbelief. Maybe I had turned it on in my sleep? But no, I knew I had switched it off. I distinctly remembered doing so. I got out of bed, the floor cold under my bare feet, and went over to the lamp. It was warm to the touch, as if it had been on for a while. My pulse quickened as I turned it off again, this time making sure it stayed off. The faintest hint of unease crept up my spine, but I tried to brush it off. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was a faulty switch. Maybe the lamp was somehow malfunctioning. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was late in the morning, the sun high in the sky. I decided to get out of the room and grab breakfast in the hotel's dining area. Anything to take my mind off the odd occurrence. As I walked down the hallway, the same feeling from last night washed over me. The silence, the heaviness of the air. It was like a weight pressing on my chest. The hallway was still just as empty as the night before, and the doors to the rooms remained closed. The hotel seemed deserted, but I didn't see any signs of life. No staff, no other guests. It was strange, but not alarming. Maybe it was just an off day for the place, or perhaps I was just overthinking things. When I reached the dining area, I was relieved to see that it wasn't as empty as it feared. The large, open room was still mostly deserted, but there was one man sitting at a table near the far end, eating his breakfast alone. I gave a small nod to the man as I made my way to a table closer to the windows. The server, a young man who looked tired, handed me a menu without much enthusiasm. His eyes were red-rimmed, as if he hadn't had a full night's sleep in weeks. I ordered a coffee and toast, trying to shake off the odd feeling that had been following me since I arrived. When the man left, I glanced around the room, my eyes lingering on the old paintings that decorated the walls. They were portraits of people who, at one point, must have been important to the hotel. Their faces were cold, almost too lifelike. It was hard to tell whether they were staring at me or just frozen in time. My coffee arrived, but the unease didn't fade. I felt like I was being watched, even though no one else seemed to be paying attention to me. I sipped my drink slowly, staring at the steam rising from the cup, trying to convince myself that I was just tired. But something in the back of my mind told me this wasn't normal. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I had a feeling that whatever was happening in this hotel was far from ordinary. As I ate, I overheard the man at the other table speaking in low, murmuring tones. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but his words were punctuated by long pauses, as if he were trying to make sense of something, or perhaps explaining something to himself. His voice was strained, like someone caught in a state of perpetual worry. I watched him for a few moments, and that's when I noticed it. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated, as if he hadn't been sleeping well either. Eventually, the man stood up, paid for his meal, and left the dining room. I went back to my room shortly after, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that followed me. Something wasn't right, and I had a growing suspicion that it wasn't just in my head. That night, the unsettling events took another strange turn. I had decided to take a short walk around the hotel grounds to clear my mind, but the minute I stepped outside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was cooler than it had been earlier, and the sky had taken on an eerie shade of gray, as if the clouds were hanging just a little too low. The hotel stood at the edge of the woods, and the trees rustled in the winds, but the sound felt distant, muffled. I walked along the small path leading to the back of the hotel, hoping the fresh air would help clear my thoughts. As I passed the small garden, I noticed a small, rusted gate leading into a narrow alley. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a look. The alley was dark, even though the sun hadn't fully set. It felt like I was being drawn in, though I couldn't explain why. I turned the corner, and that's when I saw it. A door, standing slightly ajar. It was a wooden door, weathered with age, leading into what appeared to be a small, forgotten building behind the hotel. There was no sign indicating it was part of the hotel, and it looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing unnervingly in the quiet night. Inside, it was dark, but I could make out the outlines of old furniture, some covered in dusty sheets, others just abandoned. The air inside felt heavier, more oppressive than in the rest of the hotel, as if something were weighing it down. I took a few cautious steps in, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. And that's when I heard it, a soft, deliberate thud from somewhere deeper in the building. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, listening. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that didn't belong. I turned around, ready to leave, but when I tried to push the door open, it wouldn't budge. My heart started to race as I pulled harder, but the door remained firmly shut. That's when I realized I was trapped inside the building. Panic set in. I pounded on the door, calling out, hoping someone would hear me. But there was no answer. The silence returned, and with it, the feeling of being watched. I could hear my own breath, shallow and panicked. It was then that I noticed the shadows, moving just out of my line of sight. I couldn't make out anything clearly, but I felt the distinct presence of someone, watching me. I pressed my back against the door, trying to calm my racing heart. I don't know how much time passed before the door finally gave way and I stumbled out, gasping for air. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my room. But when I got there, I found something even more disturbing. The lamp, the one I had turned off earlier, was on again. The same weak, flickering light, casting long, strange shadows on the wall. And as I looked closer, I saw that the shadows seemed to move, almost as if they were alive. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The events of the past 24 hours had gone from awed to terrifying, and I was beginning to wonder if I'd ever be able to leave this place. The following day, the unease that had settled over me didn't fade. If anything, it grew more intense with each passing hour. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with this hotel, something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. The subtle occurrences it brushed off before now seemed to escalate, and with each strange event, I felt more and more like a character trapped in some sort of eerie narrative, unsure of how to escape. It started with the mirrors. The first time I noticed it was while I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom. I looked up, catching my reflection in the cracked mirror, and saw something strange. It wasn't that the reflection was out of place, but the way it lingered. My own face appeared almost too still, like it wasn't me at all. I stared at the mirror for a long moment, the sound of the running water filling the otherwise silent room. The longer I looked, the more my reflection seemed to grow unfamiliar. The lines of my face appeared softer, the shadows under my eyes darker. And there was a moment, just a brief flicker, when I thought I saw something move behind me, just over my shoulder. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. Nothing. The silence felt almost suffocating. I turned back to the mirror, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. But even as I finished brushing my teeth, that lingering sense of dread didn't go away. Later that afternoon, I decided to leave my room and try to get some air. I figured maybe a change of scenery would help. The hotel's lobby, as I expected, was still empty. The floors creaked under my feet as I made my way to the front door, only to find it locked. This was odd, as I was sure I had seen the door open earlier in the morning when I went for breakfast. I shook the handle a few times, but it wouldn't budge. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped away from the door. It felt as though the hotel itself was closing in around me, trapping me inside. I decided to make my way to the back of the hotel, hoping to find a way out or at least get a better look at the grounds. The hallway, dimly lit as always, seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and mildew, and the sound of my footsteps echoed, unnervingly loud in the silence. I reached the rear staircase, and as I made my way up, I noticed something peculiar. There was a door on the second floor I hadn't seen before. It wasn't listed on the floor plan, and it wasn't on the hotel's official map either. It was at the end of a narrow, dark hallway, a door with peeling paint and an old brass handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity gnawed at me as I approached it. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, before finally reaching for the handle. It was cold to the touch, but as I turned it, I heard a faint click. The door creaked open. Inside, the room was dark. A small square window let in just enough light to cast eerie shadows on the walls. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old books and dust. There was a long desk along one wall, covered in piles of yellowed papers, some of which looked like old hotel records. The room had an abandoned feel, but there was also something else, a faint sense of presence, like I wasn't alone. I stepped further in, my senses heightened. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and I glanced around, scanning the room. There was a small chair near the desk, its back turned as though someone had been sitting in it recently. But when I stepped closer, I saw that it was covered in a layer of dust, untouched. Everything in the room was in disarray, as if it had been left in a hurry, yet everything was too perfectly placed, almost deliberate. My eyes settled on the window. The glass was cracked, as if someone had tried to break through from the outside. But when I leaned in closer, I saw something else, something that stopped me cold. On the other side of the cracked glass was a figure. It was faint, almost transparent, but there was no mistaking it a woman, standing in the distance, looking up at me. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, a long black gown that seemed to blend into the shadows. Her face was obscured, but I could make out the faintest outline of her features. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in the room felt thicker now, harder to breathe. It wasn't just the humidity, it was something else, something unnatural. I turned to leave, but as I grabbed the door handle to exit, I heard it. The faintest of whispers, low and unintelligible. It was coming from somewhere in the room, but there was no one else here. I pushed the door open with force, not caring what the source of the voice was. The last thing I saw before the door shut behind me was the figure in the window, now standing much closer, her eyes fixed on me. I rushed down the stairs, my legs shaky beneath me, and made my way back to my room. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, the door locked behind me. As the day turned into night, the hotel seemed to grow even more oppressive. The walls groaned, and the floors creaked louder than before, as though they were trying to make their presence known. The temperature seemed to drop despite the heating being on full blast. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched out unnaturally long, creeping across the floor and walls. I felt a sense of constant movement, like something was always just out of my sight, waiting for me to turn my head. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Every noise, every creak of the building made my heart race. I was just about to close my eyes when I heard the faintest sound, footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate, as if someone were pacing back and forth. I held my breath, listening closely. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then there was a knock. At first, it was soft, almost polite. But as I didn't respond, it grew louder, more insistent, as if whoever was on the other side knew I was in the room, knew I was listening. I stayed silent, my heart hammering in my chest. Whoever it was, I wasn't going to open that door. Then came the sound of a key turning in the lock. I jumped back, frozen in place. The door rattled, as if someone were trying to force it open, but the lock held. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the door, knowing I had to do something, anything, to stop whatever was happening. But it wasn't over yet. The knocking came again, this time from a different direction. I could hear it now from the window, faint, tapping lightly against the glass. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, dialing the front desk, but the line was dead. I tried again, but it was no use. The hotel was empty. The night had descended upon the hotel with an unnatural stillness, almost as if the entire building had gone to sleep, save for me. I sat on the edge of my bed, frozen, unsure of what to do next. Every noise seemed amplified. Every creak, every shift of the building's old bones made my skin crawl. But then came the sound that changed everything. A voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, sharp, and unmistakable. It came from the darkness of the room, from the very corner I had tried to ignore all evening. My body stiffened, my eyes scanning the shadows, searching for the source of the voice. The words were soft, almost like a prayer or chant. "You shouldn't have come here." My heart skipped a beat. Panic seized me. The air grew thicker, the oppressive atmosphere I had felt all day now suffocating. The temperature dropped so rapidly that I could see my breath hanging in the air, like a cold fog that didn't belong in the room. I stood, my knees weak, the room spinning around me. There was no turning back now. Something was happening, something I couldn't escape. The voice came again, this time from behind me, a low rasping sound that sent a wave of ice through my veins. "You've disturbed us." I spun around, half expecting to see the woman from the window, but the room was still empty. No one stood there, just the same flickering light overhead and the shadows creeping along the floor, stretching unnaturally long. My mind raced. My eyes darted to the door, but it was locked, just as it had been for the past hour. Without thinking, I grabbed the handle of the drawer beside the bed, pulling it open in a frantic motion, desperate for something, anything, that might offer an explanation or a weapon to defend myself. But the drawer was empty, save for a single folded piece of paper. I hesitated, then unfolded it, the creaking of the paper loud in the silence. It was old, tattered, and yellowed with age. As I read the first line, my blood ran cold. Room 217 holds more than just memories. It holds the lost. The words seemed to burn themselves into my brain, each syllable heavier than the last. What was this? What did it mean? Before I could process it, the air in the room seemed to pulse, alive, as though the hotel itself was breathing, and it wasn't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift and writhe, twisting into shapes that seemed almost human. The walls groaned, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. The door rattled again, but this time it didn't stop. A loud crash came from the other side, followed by the unmistakable sound of nails scraping against wood. The room shook as if something immense was trying to force its way inside. I backed away, pressing myself against the far wall, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of everything. What had I gotten myself into? What was behind that door? Then the door burst open. I saw her, the woman from the window. The same pale face, her eyes hollow and lifeless, her expression unreadable. Her long black dress trailed behind her, a shadow that clung to the very air. She didn't speak, but her presence was suffocating. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my body wouldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off her, her cold, empty stare, the way she seemed to glide toward me, as if the very space around her bent to her will. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. The room fell silent, and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. I stood there, trembling, unsure of what I had just witnessed. Had it been a hallucination? Had I finally lost my grip on reality? I didn't have time to think. The ground beneath me trembled again, harder this time, as though the building itself was alive. The walls began to crack, long jagged lines splitting the old plaster, revealing the dark, decaying wood beneath. The hotel, this place, was not just abandoned. It was a prison, one that held far more than just memories. With a jolt, I remembered the note. The lost, was it referring to the spirits trapped in this place? The woman was just one of many, perhaps. As I stood frozen, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. There was no escape. Whatever had been awakened, whatever had been disturbed by my presence, wasn't going to let me leave. Not without paying the price. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen again, this time surrounding me. The walls seemed to close in, the very air becoming thick and suffocating. It was as if the hotel was swallowing me whole, dragging me deeper into its dark heart. The woman reappeared, this time standing in the middle of the room. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, she spoke. "Now you'll stay with us. Forever." Her voice was hollow, devoid of life, but somehow it reverberated through every fiber of my being. It was the voice of 100 lost souls, and I could feel myself being pulled into it, a wave of terror crashing over me. My vision blurred, and I stumbled backward, desperately searching for an exit, but there was nowhere to go. The door was no longer a door. It had become just another part of the wall, the wood warped and distorted, as though the hotel itself had consumed it. The window, too, was sealed shut. There was no way out. I was trapped. As the shadows closed in around me, I screamed out of sheer terror, out of helplessness. But no sound came. It was as if the hotel had swallowed my voice, leaving me in complete, suffocating silence. And then, just as suddenly as everything had started, there was a deafening roar, like the sound of 1,000 storms crashing together. The walls shook violently, and the floor beneath me gave way. The shadows rose, swirling, pulling me down into the abyss below. The last thing I remembered before everything went dark was the sensation of falling, being swallowed by the very hotel that had trapped me. My mind couldn't comprehend what was happening. My senses were overwhelmed, and my heart beat so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. When I finally regained consciousness, it was to silence. I opened my eyes, blinking in the dim light. The room was different now, less oppressive, but still unsettling. The walls were cracked, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight as I tried to stand. The air smelled stale, and I could still feel the lingering cold in my bones. But there were no shadows, no voices, no eerie presence watching me. I was alone. I staggered to my feet, my legs weak, every part of me trembling as if the fall had taken something more than just my balance. I was alive, but I felt different, like a part of me had been left behind in that nightmare. The oppressive feeling was gone, but so was the relief. I was too afraid to find out if it would come back. The door was still locked, but now the handle turned easily in my hand. I opened it slowly, the creak of the door breaking the heavy silence that enveloped me. I stepped out into the hallway, my eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of life. The hotel was quiet, too quiet. No signs of movement, no noise from the rooms, just emptiness. And it was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing, feeling surreal, like I was moving through a dream. The oppressive atmosphere that had once made my heart race now seemed to have evaporated, but there was a lingering sense that something wasn't right. I wasn't sure if it was the building itself, or the knowledge that something terrible had happened in these walls. I made my way to the staircase, the air getting colder with each step I took. The temperature continued to drop, and I shivered involuntarily. A low, rumbling sound filled the space, like the very foundation of the hotel was groaning in protest. I paused, listening intently. It was the same sound that had filled the building during my worst moments, the feeling that something was just out of sight, waiting. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it, the front door, the exit, the only way out of this place. I rushed toward it, my heart pounding. But when I touched the handle, the door didn't budge. It felt as though an invisible force was pressing against it, holding it shut. I pulled harder, desperate to escape, but the door wouldn't open. I slammed my shoulder against it, feeling the impact rattle through my bones, but it was no use. The hotel wasn't going to let me go that easily. Just then, I heard a voice again, this time from behind me. The same cold, detached tone. "You cannot leave." I froze, my body rigid with fear. It was her, the woman. But this time, I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel her presence, like a weight pressing down on me, like the very air had changed. It wasn't just her voice. It was everything. The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to grow, slowly, deliberately, stretching as if they had a life of their own. I backed away from the door, heart racing, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The woman stood there, watching me from the darkness. I didn't understand. What did she want? Why was she here? What was this place? "Why are you doing this?" I finally managed to ask, my voice cracking with fear. Her answer was simple, cold. "You disturbed us." I felt the air shift again, the pressure mounting. There was no escaping. Not this time. The hotel had claimed me, and I knew it wouldn't let go until it had gotten what it wanted. But what could I do? I didn't have the strength to fight whatever was controlling this place. I was nothing more than a prisoner, a pawn in its dark game. But as I stood there, frozen, I felt something change. The shadows seemed to recoil slightly, as if they had heard my thoughts. And then I understood. I wasn't alone. Not entirely. There were others. Others who had come before me. Others who had been trapped in this place. Their presence wasn't as tangible as the woman's, but it was there, in the whispers that danced through the walls, in the sudden warmth that radiated from the room. I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. They weren't trying to harm me, not directly. They were trying to help me. The woman turned to leave, fading into the darkness, her form dissolving into the very air. The room began to shift once more, the walls creaking as the hotel seemed to come alive again. But now it was different. The oppressive weight of the place had lifted, and the voices, while still present, felt less threatening, more like a plea for understanding. I didn't know how, but I understood. The hotel wasn't evil. It wasn't alive in the way I had first thought. It was trapped too. The spirits, the shadows, the strange force, it was all the same. The hotel itself had become a prison for the lost, those who had passed through its doors and never left. The woman, too, was lost, a part of this world and the next, unable to move on because the building held her, bound by its curse. I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay here any longer. I ran back to the door and pulled with every ounce of strength I had left. This time, the door didn't resist. It opened, and the cold night air rushed in, almost too much to bear after the suffocating atmosphere inside. I stepped outside, taking a deep breath as the fresh air filled my lungs. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. The hotel, the woman, the shadows, they were all behind me now. But as I stood there, in the stillness of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped, not really. Some things never leave. And the hotel would always be there, waiting for the next person who would stumble into its grasp. I left the hotel behind, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. The cold air had a sharpness to it, as if it were cleansing me of the weight I carried. The road ahead stretched out before me, empty and silent. But something was different. Something inside me had changed. The memories of the woman, of the shadows, of the air that had felt so thick with sorrow, it all seemed too distant now, like a dream fading with the morning light. But it wasn't gone. The hotel, the spirits trapped within its walls, they were still there, just beyond my reach. I couldn't erase what had happened. I didn't think I would ever be able to. I thought about leaving. I thought about never returning, letting the whole experience slip into the realm of forgotten nightmares. But I knew that wasn't possible. I couldn't forget. I couldn't forget the weight of those eyes, the way the walls seemed to breathe with life, how the voices whispered and pleaded, asking for release. I wasn't the same person I was when I had walked into that hotel. I didn't know if I was the same person who had walked out. The drive home felt long and aimless. The scenery passed in a blur, the world outside looking like something I could no longer touch. I wanted to believe I was safe, but the unsettling feeling never fully left me. It lingered in the corners of my mind, a constant hum in the back of my thoughts. It wasn't just fear, it was understanding, an understanding of what had happened, of what had been trapped in that place. It wasn't just a hotel. It was a tomb, a prison built on stories of loss and regret. When I finally arrived home, the familiar sights of my neighborhood did little to ease the weight pressing on my chest. The silence was deafening. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering the strength to step out. There was no escaping it. The hotel was still with me. I was still with it. We had both left our marks on each other. It's funny though. There's a part of me that feels like I'm still there, walking down those empty hallways. I can still hear the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, feel the chill in the air, and even sense the woman watching me, her eyes always just out of reach. I wonder if that's a part of the curse, the lingering presence, the feeling that no matter how far you go, you'll always be tied to the place. A connection that can't be severed, no matter how much you want to forget. I've tried to move on. tried to push the memories aside and convince myself that it was all in my head. But the truth is, I don't know if you'll ever be able to escape it. I don't know if anyone can. Maybe the hotel, in its twisted way, is still waiting for someone else to cross its threshold. Maybe it's already begun with someone else, someone who will become the next person to hear its whispers, to feel its cold embrace. I haven't gone back. I don't plan to. But every time I close my eyes, I see it. The hotel, the darkness, the eyes, and the question that has haunted me from the very beginning. What was it all for? Was it punishment? Or was it simply the nature of a place that can never truly die? The answers are elusive. They always have been, and they likely always will be. I can't help but wonder if there are others like me, people who've left, who thought they'd escaped, but who can never truly forget. The ones who, like me, carry the weight of that hotel wherever they go, knowing that part of them will always be bound to it, no matter how far they run. The story isn't over. It never will be. Not for me, and not for anyone who's ever stepped through those doors. It was supposed to be a simple job, nothing extraordinary, just a quiet few weeks away from the hustle and bustle of city life. At least, that's how I convinced myself. I had been working for a small coastal town about an hour's drive from the nearest city. The kind of place where everything felt almost too calm, too peaceful, almost like it belonged in a different time. The lighthouse stood on the edge of a craggy cliff, overlooking the dark, endless expanse of the sea. I had heard rumors about the lighthouse, but rumors were just that, stories told by people with too much time on their hands. I had a job to do, and the pay was good, so when the offer came to stay and maintain the light for a few weeks, I didn't hesitate. It was just me and a couple of others. Tim, the lighthouse keeper, and Maggie, his daughter, who had been helping him for as long as I could remember. I had been given a room in the lighthouse tower, with the sea air blowing through the open windows and the constant, reassuring hum of the machinery. It was a small but charming place, nothing extravagant, but peaceful enough that I could focus on what I had come there to do, repair the light, and keep things running smoothly. I was used to isolation, having lived in the country most of my life. But this kind of isolation felt different. The kind of isolation that made your thoughts echo in the silence, that made the faintest sounds seem louder and the moon's glow sharper. The first few days went by uneventfully. I spent my mornings checking the lighthouse equipment, my afternoons walking along the rocky shoreline, and my nights either reading or staring out at the dark waters below. It was the perfect escape, if you could ignore the creeping feeling that something was a little off. The town was small, with only a handful of people living there. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing changed. Maggie would come to the lighthouse often, bringing her father some lunch, chatting with me about the weather, the tides, or sometimes nothing at all. It was clear she was used to the solitude that came with living so far away from the nearest neighbor. And Tim, he was a man of few words. Mostly he stayed to himself, watching the waves and making sure the lighthouse was running properly. But there was a sense of something else behind his eyes, a quiet tension, like he was waiting for something to happen. I didn't think much of it at first. I was there for work, and I had no reason to think otherwise. But as the days wore on, little things began to stand out. It wasn't anything drastic, not at first. There were just these subtle shifts, changes in the air, the way the sound of the waves would change when the wind picked up, and the strange, almost unexplainable sense that something wasn't quite right. But it wasn't enough to make me want to leave, at least not yet. After all, it was just the lighthouse, the sea, and the slow, predictable rhythm of life out there on the edge of the world. And then one evening, everything changed. It was one of those clear nights when the moon shone bright, and the waves below seemed to glow in the cold light. I had just finished my shift and was preparing to settle in for the night when Tim came up to my room. His face was pale, his hands were trembling slightly, and his eyes, they weren't the same. There was something about him that wasn't right. He asked if he'd seen anything strange. At first, I thought it was just his nerves talking, the isolation getting to him. But when I looked at him, really looked at him, I could tell something was wrong. Something was happening at the lighthouse, something he wasn't telling me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something waiting, just beyond the reach of the light. Something in the sea, something in the air, something that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. As I lay in bed, staring out the window at the dark horizon, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, those rumors about the lighthouse weren't so far-fetched after all. The first real sign that something wasn't right came on the third night of my stay. It was an uneventful day, much like the others. I had finished my duties at the lighthouse, checking the foghorn, making sure the light was functioning properly, and tidying up the place. Tim had been his usual quiet self, and Maggie had brought me some tea as she did every evening. The world around the lighthouse was its usual blend of salt and wind, the sound of crashing waves echoing off the rocks below, creating that rhythm of isolation that had begun to feel oddly comforting. That evening, however, there was a change. I didn't notice it at first. It was subtle, just a shift in the air. The atmosphere, which had felt so heavy with stillness before, suddenly seemed charged, as if the wind had picked up in ways I couldn't explain. The ocean, usually so calm under the moonlight, had begun to churn in the distance, the waves crashing louder than usual. But the most unsettling part wasn't the waves or the wind, it was the silence that followed. I had been standing by the window in my room, watching the sea, when everything went eerily still. The wind stopped, the crashing waves grew faint, and even the chirping of the distant seagulls seemed to have vanished. The sudden silence felt unnatural, as though the world had simply paused, holding its breath. I stood there for a few seconds, unsure of what to make of it. The silence stretched on, and I couldn't help but feel an uneasy weight pressing on my chest. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the wind changing direction. But then the light in the lighthouse flickered. It wasn't just a regular flicker, like when a bulb is on the verge of going out. This was different. It was as if the entire lighthouse light had hesitated, paused, and then came back on, as though something had briefly interrupted its function. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine, but I chalked it up to the wind again. It heard stories about how weather could affect the equipment out here, especially with the salt in the air. But even as I told myself that, something deep in my gut told me this wasn't the usual malfunction. I decided to go down to the lower levels to check the light. The staircase creaked beneath my feet as I descended into the cold stone tower. The air down there was damp, and the faint smell of old machinery filled my nostrils. It was a strange place to be in the dark, isolated and cut off from the world, but I had grown used to it by now. As I approached the light mechanism, I was met with an odd sight. The light, which had been functioning perfectly fine just hours before, was now dimming in and out of focus on its own. I stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure whether to touch it. I had worked with plenty of machinery in my life, but this felt different. It wasn't just a technical glitch. It was as though something was actively interfering with it. I tried to adjust the settings, but as my hand hovered near the controls, I noticed something strange. The air around me seemed to get colder, the the temperature dropping by several degrees. It wasn't a gradual change, it felt as though a chill had swept in all at once. I quickly stepped back, pulling my hand away from the controls, but the sensation lingered. The room felt wrong, like it was closing in on me. Then, as I turned to leave, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, a fleeting movement. At first, I thought it was my own reflection in the glass, but no, this was something else. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the steady hum of the machinery and the low, rhythmic sound of the waves crashing below. I was unnerved, but I didn't say anything to Tim. I didn't want to worry him. He was already acting odd lately, and I didn't want to add fuel to whatever fire seemed to be brewing inside the lighthouse. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next day, I asked Maggie about it when I ran into her while she was bringing lunch to her father. She was her usual quiet self, but there was something about her expression that made me pause. She seemed distant, as if she were deep in thought, but there was also a flash of concern in her eyes when I mentioned the strange light malfunction. "Did you feel anything strange last night?" I asked, casually, trying not to sound too paranoid. She hesitated before responding, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should talk to my dad," she said, her gaze flicking nervously towards the lighthouse tower. "He's the one who knows about the history here." I didn't press her further. Instead, I went to find Tim later that afternoon. He was sitting outside the lighthouse, staring out at the waves with his usual grim expression. I asked him about the strange occurrences, the flickering light, the chill in the air, the shadows, and for the first time, he actually looked at me, really looked at me. There was something in his eyes that was hard to read, something like fear. "You should go inside, get some rest," he said quickly, his tone far more urgent than I had ever heard from him. "Nothing's wrong with the lighthouse. You're just imagining things." His words didn't comfort me. If anything, they only made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up even more. Something in his reaction didn't sit right. Tim was always calm, collected, but now he was on edge, like he was afraid to even acknowledge the reality of what was happening. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was just out of sight, just beyond my reach. The lighthouse seemed to breathe with its own life, the wind howling against the walls and the distant crashing of waves playing on a loop. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that cold, dimly lit tower, staring at the light that seemed to flicker on its own. The shadows, the strange chill, the way everything had seemed to freeze for just a moment. It was too much. The following night, things got worse. The light flickered again, but this time, it didn't stop. The entire lighthouse seemed to shudder as if something was trying to tear it apart from the inside. I rushed down to check the machinery, but when I got there, the air was thick with an unnatural cold, and the shadow, this time it was unmistakable, was standing right in front of the light. It was a figure, dark and almost translucent, but with the unmistakable shape of a person. It moved toward me slowly, deliberately, and in that moment, I understood. Whatever was haunting the lighthouse wasn't just in my head. It was real. It was here. The figure stopped in front of me, its eyes empty, its presence suffocating. My heart raced, my breath caught in my throat, and the only thing I could do was turn and run. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. As I raced back to my room, my mind was reeling. I had seen it. I had felt it. And I knew then that this lighthouse wasn't just haunted by memories. It was haunted by something much darker. Something that had been waiting for me. The days that followed were a blur of unease and growing fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with the lighthouse. What had once felt like a peaceful haven for isolation now felt like a prison. Every corner seemingly haunted by shadows. Every gust of wind whispering secrets I couldn't understand. The flickering light continued, now happening more frequently. It wasn't just the lighthouse light, the lights in the rooms, the lamps, even the occasional candle I would set up in an attempt to calm my nerves. Nothing stayed steady. They would flicker, casting unsettling shadows across the walls, like broken memories refusing to stay in place. Each time the light blinked out, it felt as though a cold hand was pulling the life out of the room, and I was left in the suffocating grip of an unseen presence. That night, I decided I had had enough. It wasn't just the machinery malfunctioning, nor was it just the weird shadows it seen. It was everything: the silence, the unnatural cold, the way the lighthouse seemed to shudder with a breath that wasn't its own. I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed answers, and I wasn't about to leave until I found them. Maggie, ever the quiet observer, had become even more distant. She no longer met my eyes when we passed in the hallways. She stopped speaking to me altogether, but I knew deep down that she was just as affected by what was happening. Her father, Tim, had retreated into his own world, avoiding any conversation about the lighthouse's history. Had become more erratic, his once disciplined demeanor unraveling as though he were under some strange, unseen pressure. I made my decision that night. I would search the lighthouse, starting from the top, and I wouldn't stop until I understood what was going on. I was determined to find answers, even if it meant confronting whatever haunted this place. The wind howled outside, and the cold seeped through the thick stone walls as I climbed the spiral staircase once more. I could feel the temperature drop the higher I went, the air growing denser with each step, as if the very building was inhaling a breath it couldn't exhale. The smell of salt and rust hung in the air, clinging to the damp walls like old memories. I reached the lantern room, the highest point in the lighthouse, and was greeted by a strange, almost suffocating stillness. The light had been flickering even more rapidly than usual, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. My eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything that might explain the disturbance. And then I saw it. At first, it was a movement, a figure just beyond the edge of the light, barely visible. But it was enough. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest, praying I was wrong. As I peered into the darkness, I realized with horror that it wasn't my imagination. There was someone, or something, standing there, just out of reach of the light. I swallowed hard, the air feeling thick and oppressive. I took a cautious step forward, my hand reaching for the light switch, but the figure seemed to retreat, vanishing into the darkness before I could even touch the switch. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone, that I was being watched by something far older and more dangerous than I could ever understand. I backed away, my feet stumbling on the uneven floor. The cold air seemed to press in from all sides, and I turned to leave, but then the light flickered again. The shadow returned, but this time it wasn't alone. There were more. Figures, pale and indistinct, hovering at the edges of the light like ghosts in a fog. The air grew thick, and the pressure in my chest mounted. I stumbled down the staircase, my breath ragged as I rushed back to my room. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. I could feel them following me. The darkness seemed to stretch around me, the walls closing in like a tightening noose. When I finally reached my room, I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it, panting as if I had run a marathon. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something was closing in on me. The walls of the lighthouse, once so familiar, now felt like they were caving in, and the very air I breathed seemed suffocating. The following day, Tim was gone. I found his room empty, the bed made as if he had never slept in it. His belongings were gone, his clothes, his tools, everything. Maggie was in the kitchen when I entered, staring at the table, her hands pressed to her face, as if she had been crying for hours. "Maggie," I called, my voice shaking. "Where's Tim?" She didn't answer at first, her eyes vacant. When she finally looked up at me, her expression was one of complete terror. "He's gone," she whispered. He's not coming back." I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. The way she said it, it wasn't just fear in her voice. It was resignation. "What do you mean he's not coming back?" I pressed. She trembled as she spoke, her voice barely audible. "He's been hearing them too. The voices. They told him to leave." I didn't waste any more time. I knew I had to find out what was happening before it was too late. Maggie was too afraid to speak more, but I knew I couldn't rely on her for help. The shadows in the lighthouse had already taken her father. I was next. That night, as the wind howled and the waves crashed violently against the rocks below, I ventured down into the lower levels of the lighthouse. The air was colder than ever before, the shadows deeper. I moved with purpose now, knowing the danger I was in, knowing that every moment I delayed meant one more moment I might not survive. I reached the lower levels, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The deeper I went, the colder the air became, until it was so frigid I could see my breath in the beam of the light. The smell of mildew and rust filled the air, and the walls felt damp under my hands as I searched for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. As I moved deeper into the lighthouse, I found it a hidden door. It was old, nearly concealed by dust and grime, and it creaked loudly as I pulled it open. Beyond it lay a narrow staircase leading into the unknown. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and as I stepped inside, the sound of my footsteps echoed loudly in the silence. I descended into the darkness, unsure of what I would find. Every step felt heavier, the oppressive weight of whatever haunted this place closing in around me. The deeper I went, the more I felt it, something watching me from the shadows, something that didn't belong in this world. The temperature dropped even further, until I could feel my fingers stiffening, my skin aching from the cold. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, bathed in the flickering light of my flashlight, was a figure. It was standing perfectly still, its face hidden in shadow, its presence overwhelming. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew in that moment that I had found whatever had been haunting this place. And it wasn't going to let me leave. For a moment, I questioned my sanity. Was I really seeing this? Could it be my mind playing tricks on me, a result of the stress, the lack of sleep, the fear? But no, this wasn't a hallucination. I could feel the weight of the figure's presence in my chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The thing in front of me wasn't human, not in the way I understood it. Its outline was vague, shifting with the shadows. It had no definite features, no eyes that could be seen, but there was something about the way it loomed in the darkness that made my blood run cold. It was as if it existed in a state between reality and something else, something far darker. My hand shook as I reached for the flashlight's beam, but it flickered and died, leaving me in complete darkness. I had no idea what was happening, but the silence in that moment was deafening. I fumbled to turn the light back on, my heart racing, my breathing erratic. When the beam finally flickered back to life, the figure was gone, but I could feel its presence, as though it was standing just behind me, its invisible fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I whipped around, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to run. But there was nothing, only the cold, damp air and the oppressive darkness. I didn't know how much longer I could stay in the lighthouse. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and every moment felt like it could be my last. I needed to find out what this thing was, what had brought it here, and why it was tormenting us. As I turned to leave the room, the wall seemed to stretch, the distance between me and the staircase growing longer, as if the lighthouse itself was changing. The stone steps beneath my feet creaked, groaned, and shuddered as I ascended, my hand grasping the banister for support. But then, the ground beneath me buckled. I was thrown off balance, crashing into the floor as the lighthouse seemed to groan, as if some unseen force were shaking it to its core. I scrambled to my feet, the noise reverberating through the structure. I could hear faint whispers now, echoing from deep within the stone, voices that rose and fell in unnatural cadence, voices that seemed to reach out to me, calling my name. Panic surged within me as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. My name was being repeated over and over again, faintly at first, then louder, as though they were surrounding me. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't care. I just ran. I raced up the stairs, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest, and when I reached the top, I was greeted by the sight of Maggie. She was standing at the doorway, staring into the darkness. But there was something wrong about her eyes, something distant, almost vacant. It was as if she wasn't really there. "Maggie," I shouted, rushing toward her, but she didn't move. Her body was rigid, her expression frozen in place. "Maggie, snap out of it." I shook her shoulder, desperate, but she didn't respond. It was as if I wasn't even there, as if I were invisible. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again, the figure. The one that had haunted me in the lower levels of the lighthouse. It wasn't just standing at the doorway this time. It was right behind Maggie. Its form flickered in and out of existence, like a shadow struggling to keep itself intact. The more I looked at it, the more it seemed to distort, its features shifting in a way that made my skin crawl. "Get away from her," I screamed, stepping forward, trying to push the figure back. But my hand passed through it, and the figure didn't budge. I grabbed Maggie by the arm and pulled her away from the doorway. Her body was cold, unnaturally so, and as I yanked her toward the staircase, she finally stirred, blinking as if waking from a trance. Her eyes were wide, full of fear and confusion. What happened?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked around, her gaze falling on the space where the figure had been standing. But it was gone now. "We need to leave," I said, my voice hoarse with panic. "We need to get out of here now." But as I turned to lead her down the stairs, the ground beneath us trembled again. This time, it wasn't just the walls shaking. The entire lighthouse seemed to be shifting, groaning under some unseen pressure. The lighthouse, once a symbol of stability, was now a tomb. I could hear the floorboards creak, groan, as though the very structure of the place was being ripped apart. We ran down the stairs, the sounds of the whispers growing louder, following us, chasing us. I couldn't tell if it was the lighthouse itself or if something far worse was pulling us deeper into the abyss. We reached the bottom, but the exit was blocked by the figure. It stood at the door, blocking our way, its shadowy form now more defined than ever, as though it had been waiting for us. It was no longer a vague shape. Its features were clear now, torn, twisted, and impossible to look at for long. Its mouth, wide and grotesque, opened slowly, and I could hear it speak, though its voice was distant, distorted. "You cannot leave," it hissed, its voice like grinding stone, sending a jolt of ice down my spine. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want from us?" But the figure only stared, its hollow eyes boring into mine. A cold chill filled the room, and I could feel the temperature drop as though the very air had turned to ice. It reached out with a long skeletal hand, and in that moment, I realized the truth. The lighthouse wasn't haunted by a single spirit. It was a prison, a place where lost souls were trapped, forever bound by whatever force had once controlled it. The figure was not just a ghost. It was the keeper of the lighthouse, the guardian of something ancient, something far darker than I had ever imagined. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. It was as if the figure was suffocating me with its presence, pressing the air from my lungs. The walls around us seemed to close in, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding us, filling my mind with a maddening static. In that moment, I understood. We weren't just dealing with ghosts. We were dealing with something far worse, a force that had been lying in wait, dormant, until now. The figure's outstretched hand loomed before us, skeletal fingers glistening in the faint light, its form swirling with darkness. Every instinct within me screamed to run, to flee, but the weight of the air in the lighthouse felt suffocating, like something was pressing down on me, urging me to stay in this twisted moment, trapped in its gravity. I looked at Maggie, her face pale and frozen, eyes wide in terror, but she seemed rooted to the spot as much as I was. The seconds dragged on, stretching into eternity, until I felt a coldness that wasn't just from the temperature. No, this was deeper. It was the coldness of fear, of defeat. "We're not going to survive this, are we?" Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible, barely there, as if speaking any louder might make it worse. I wanted to respond, to reassure her that we'd get out, that there had to be a way, but the truth was, the words caught in my throat. The figure, its hollow eyes locked on mine, was not just blocking the exit. It was waiting for us to make the first move, waiting for us to accept our fate. But we didn't have to accept it. With a forceful breath, I grabbed Maggie's arm and yanked her toward the back of the room. Her body was stiff with shock, but I could feel her trembling, could feel the grip of her hand tightening on mine. For a moment, it seemed like we might actually break free, like we might escape the terrible gravity of this place. But then, the whispers returned. Louder this time, a cacophony of voices swirling around us, their words unintelligible but full of anguish. They clawed at my mind, distracting me, pulling at my thoughts, trying to drag me back into the depths of this nightmare. I shook my head, trying to block out the voices, trying to clear my mind, but the more I fought, the more the walls seemed to close in. The shadows seemed to crawl along the floor, reaching for my feet, pulling me down into the abyss. But then, suddenly, something broke through the fog. It was a light, a sudden, bright burst that shot up from the ground, illuminating the entire room in an ethereal glow. It wasn't natural, it wasn't earthly. This light came from somewhere far deeper than I had ever imagined, somewhere beyond the walls of the lighthouse. It felt like it was coming from the very bones of the earth. The figure recoiled, its dark form dissipating like smoke caught in a breeze. It let out a low, guttural sound, as if it were being torn apart, and the whispers grew more frantic, rising in pitch as though they too were in agony. "We have to go now," I gasped, tugging Maggie harder toward the door. The light seemed to push the shadows back, but it was only temporary. I could feel the tension in the air, the pressure of something dark still hovering on the edge, ready to strike. We ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The moment our hands touched the doorknob, the door rattled violently in its frame, and a cold, bone-chilling laugh echoed through the room. The figure was back, its presence hanging thick in the air, stronger than ever before. "Do you really think you can escape?" The figure's voice rang out, deep and sinister. It wasn't speaking through its mouth, but through the very walls of the lighthouse, through the ground beneath us. "This is my domain. You are mine. All who enter are mine." Panic surged within me again, but then something snapped inside me. Something clicked, and in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about escaping the lighthouse. It wasn't just about surviving the creature before us. This was about breaking the curse that bound the lighthouse, breaking the cycle that trapped its victims within its walls. I stepped forward, my heart racing in my chest, and I shouted, "You don't own us. We're not yours to claim." The figure paused, a shudder running through its form. The light grew brighter, and with it, the shadows began to retreat. I could feel the temperature in the room rising, the air growing less suffocating, less oppressive. Maggie stood beside me, her breath shaky but steady now, her eyes locked on the figure. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Destroy it," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering in my chest. "We have to break the curse." The figure let out a low growl, the shadows around it growing thicker, darker. But the light was relentless, cutting through the darkness with an intensity that felt almost alive. "You can't break what's already been broken," the figure hissed. "You're too late. You will never leave. You are mine." But as the figure advanced toward us, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small, tarnished compass that had been my grandfather's. The one he had left me when he died. The one I hadn't thought twice about before. It was more than a trinket. It was a key. With a shout, I threw it into the air, and it began to spin rapidly, glowing with an otherworldly energy. The figure screamed in agony, its form flickering and convulsing as the compass emitted a powerful pulse of light, engulfing everything around us. The whispers turned to screeches, the shadows twisted into themselves, and the figure, once so imposing, collapsed into nothingness. In that moment, the lighthouse seemed to shudder, its foundation quaking. The walls groaned, and the entire structure seemed to collapse in on itself. But as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The air cleared, the darkness receded, and a heavy silence fell. I stood there, breathless, staring at the empty space where the figure had once stood. The compass had fallen to the ground, now still, its light dimmed to a faint glow. "We did it," Maggie whispered, her voice full of disbelief. She was trembling, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, something I hadn't seen since we had first entered this cursed place. But even as we stood there was a lingering feeling of unease. Something wasn't right. The lighthouse was silent, but there was a heaviness to the air, a weight that had not lifted. "We need to leave," I said, my voice urgent, "before it comes back." We made our way to the door again, and this time it opened without resistance. The cold night air rushed in, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe. We stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind us with a finality that made my heart skip a beat. We didn't look back. The lighthouse stood tall behind us, its silhouette stark against the dark sky. The storm had passed, the night now eerily quiet, but I knew something had changed. The curse wasn't broken. The shadows still lingered, and the darkness was far from gone. But for now, we were free. We drove for hours without speaking. The silence between us was heavy, but not uncomfortable. There were no words that could explain what we had just experienced, no language capable of conveying the weight of what we had uncovered in the depths of that lighthouse. But as we neared the edge of town, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A shadow flickering at the edge of my vision, just out of focus. I blinked, and it was gone. My pulse quickened, and I shook my head, trying to push away the nagging feeling that we hadn't fully escaped, that we hadn't really broken the curse at all. Maggie's hand brushed mine as she sat beside me, her fingers cold, but the warmth of her touch was a comfort. She didn't speak either, but her gaze lingered on me for a moment, and I could see the same questions in her eyes. The same doubt, the same fear. "Are we free?" she asked finally, her voice soft, uncertain. "I don't know," I replied. "But we have to keep moving forward. We can't go back." We didn't speak much after that. The city lights grew closer, the hum of the highway filling the space between us. But deep inside, I knew that the darkness was not truly gone. It was still there, watching, waiting. The lighthouse was silent, but the curse remained, a shadow that lingered over us. We hadn't won. We had merely survived. And as I drove into the night, I realized that some stories never truly end. They just fade into the background, leaving unanswered questions, lingering doubts. For some things, there's no closure, no resolution, only the aftermath of the shadows we leave behind. The weeks that followed our escape from the lighthouse were shrouded in a haze of exhaustion, disbelief, and unspoken dread. We tried to move on, as though returning to our old lives would erase the terror we had faced, but it didn't work. The memories lingered, haunting every quiet moment. No matter where we went, there was a constant shadow hovering at the edge of my mind. Maggie and I both knew that the lighthouse was never truly gone. It still haunted us, even in the bright daylight, even in the safety of our own homes. I tried to rationalize it, tried to tell myself it was just our minds playing tricks on us, that the fear and exhaustion had simply created a nightmare we couldn't wake from. But I knew the truth. What we encountered that night was real. I found myself staring at the sky often, looking for any sign of that unnatural darkness, any hint that the storm was still brewing. There were nights when I heard the faintest whisper on the wind, a soft, chilling murmur that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. The curse hadn't been broken. It had only been postponed. The figure, the lighthouse, it was all still out there, waiting. And it was only a matter of time before it came for us again. Maggie seemed to sense it too. She would wake in the middle of the night, her breath shallow, eyes wide and fearful. She never said anything, but I could see the same haunted look in her eyes that I felt in my own soul. We'd both changed since that night. We were different people now, people who had seen something that the world wasn't meant to know. We couldn't go back to how we were before. That innocence, that carefree sense of security was gone. The last time I saw Maggie, she was standing by the window of her apartment, staring out at the horizon, her face drawn and distant. When I asked if she was okay, she just nodded. But I could see the sadness in her eyes, the quiet acceptance of a reality that neither of us wanted to face. The lighthouse and the horrors it contained had left an indelible mark on both of us. There was no escaping it. I didn't go back to visit her after that. We both knew it was better this way. The distance between us was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I kept telling myself that eventually life would return to normal. That time would heal the wounds, that the nightmares would fade. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was no healing from this. No closure. The darkness we had faced wasn't something you could just forget. It lived within us now, a part of who we were, a part of our past that would never be erased. And so, I find myself here, standing on the edge of the ocean, the same ocean that had once seemed so comforting, so infinite. But now, it feels like a mirror to the abyss we had faced. The waves crash violently against the shore, as if they too are trapped in an eternal struggle, unable to find peace. The wind bites at my skin, cold and relentless, a reminder of the forces we had crossed. I wonder, not for the first time, whether we were ever meant to survive that night, or whether the true curse was that we did. In the distance, I can see the faint outline of the lighthouse, barely visible through the mist. It stands tall, silent, its light no longer a beacon, but a warning, a shadow that stretches out over the water. I turn away from it, my heart heavy, my steps uncertain. I can feel it watching, waiting, but I know that there's nothing I can do to stop it now. The world has a way of forcing us to move on, to keep going even when we're broken, even when we're haunted. And so, I take another step forward, knowing that no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, the shadows will always follow. They are a part of me now, woven into my soul, impossible to escape. And that's the truth of it, isn't it? No matter how far we try to go, no matter how much we try to outrun the darkness, it always finds us. Because the darkness is not just something that exists outside of us, it's something that lives within us. We are never truly free. The moment we face something like that, something so pure and terrible, it changes us. It shapes us, and we can never go back to who we were before. I think about Maggie sometimes, and I wonder if she's found peace. But then I remember the look in her eyes, that same haunted, distant expression, and I realize that none of us will ever be the same. The lighthouse stands, always waiting. It's not over. It will never be over.